Croeso i'r digwyddiad gyntaf i'r raglen gwasanaethau ymysodiadau Rywol Cymru. Welcome everyone to the first Welsh Sexual Assault Series programme events. I'm Jo Williams, I'm the Programme Director for the Welsh Sexual Assault Services, and our event today is going to be discussing adult survivors, both female and male. Just before I start, some general housekeeping rules. I'd like to inform everyone that the session will be recorded as was advertised. If everybody could please keep their cameras and mics off throughout the session. The chat box will be open for any questions, comments, which will be asked to the speakers after the end of their session, as long as the speakers are live. If the speakers are not live or unable to answer the questions will be answered following the event. So we've got a jam-packed agenda today. We're going to be having the event opened by the Victims Commissioner for England and Wales. We've got presentations from Welsh Women's Aid, a survivor advocate, New Pathways, and Trauma Stress Wales. The event has a Twitter hashtag, which if everybody could please use, which is WSAS Learning or Dysgu Gyrch, depending on which language you're preferring to tweet in. And I'd just like to say as well, as part of the event, there is some emotive content, so please keep yourselves safe, and if you feel you need to exit the event at any time, please do. We will also be we'll have the Live Fear Free helpline will be put into the chat bar. It's also behind me and will be put onto screens throughout the day. But the number is 0808 880 10 800. So if anybody feels that they need to use that, then please do. So welcome everybody again, and we will get on with the opening of our event. So I'd like to introduce the opening from the Victims Commissioner for England and Wales, Dame Vera Baird. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Vera Baird, the Victims Commissioner for Wales and England, and I'm here to welcome you to this Vada SV session, brilliantly choreographed with a survivor's voice right in the middle. You wouldn't expect the Victims Commission to say anything other than bravo. Always listen to victims, please, and you won't go far wrong. My role, as described England and Wales and England, is to promote the best practice for victims and for witnesses, not just in the criminal justice system, but everywhere post their being treated as victims. We've done on our website, you'll find lots of information about, in particular, how sexual violence victims react to their victimization, and how in particular they react to the criminal justice agencies, police, CPS and courts, and so on. And so please feel free to take a look there, because I'll just be saying a few words now. And I'm not a person trained to talk about how you deal with traumatized people. So what I'm going to say is about what victims in general need from all those who help them in the strange, alienated post-victims world in which they found themselves when they have been severely badly treated by another person. Broadly speaking, in the context of the criminal justice system, it's called procedural justice. This is what victims want. And again, there's a whole pamphlet called What Victims Want that we did a few years ago, which sets this out in more detail. But essentially, whatever the level of trauma, many victims are demeaned. They feel as if they have been reduced to rather less than a citizen, not respected by, the selfish pleasure pleasure seeking of their assailant, and they need to be restored. They need to know that we, on behalf of society, all think of them as an excellent citizen, just like ourselves. So they require information so that they can find their feet and steady themselves in the place they find them, which will be very strange to them, even if it's less so to you. If you can give them information about where they are, do it as fully as you can. If we're in something odd like the criminal justice system, explain how the whole thing works and explain how their case might proceed. Treat people with respect for that very reason, that they are currently suffering from a sense of being demeaned, a sense of guilt and shame, which are part of the reaction, have nothing to do with how they behaved, and do need to be spoken to on the basis that we think a lot of them, so that they can cope and recover from what's happened. And every contact they have with a member of the statutory authorities or those third sector brilliant charities who deliver victim services need to be taking a further step toward coping and recover. Nothing in the way we treat victims ought to make them regress, ought to make them feel worse. They already need all the help that we can give, and if we are neglectful, or if we think we know what we should do for them and don't check with them to make sure that they do think that's what they want, then we will in fact make them feel worse. So we have a very high responsibility dealing with victims. We can either re-victimize them, or we can make them step strongly toward becoming not a victim, but as your speaker today describes themselves quite rightly, as a survivor. Those basics seems to me go across all fields of activity to do with victims. I am very sorry that I can't be with you to listen to the excellent learning that there's going to be at this session, but I am very pleased to have been able to just set out, the modesty really of how all of we responsible members of agencies can and should behave toward victims. We can deliver justice to them, even as we deliver whatever the rest of our services are, and we're in the police and CPS sector, even as we deliver justice to the defendant in a different context. But two kinds of justice need to come when somebody has been badly hurt by another. Have a very good day. I think that you will, and I'm delighted to have been able to be here to say just these few words as well.
Thank you, Dame Vera, for opening our event today. We're going to be moving on now to our first presentation, which comes from the Welsh Women's Aid, and I'm delighted to introduce Maya Badham, who's a Senior Voucher SV trainer, and Anne Williams, who's the Live Free Free Helpline Manager. And they're going to be talking to us today about sexual violence within the context of domestic abuse and the value of the Live Free Free Helpline. So over to you, Maya.
Excellent, thank you. I'm just going to share. Would someone just be able to tell me if you can all see the slides, please?
Yes, we can.
Excellent, thank you so much. Barada, good morning, everyone. My name's Maya, as Joe mentioned. I would like to apologise first, but I have a bit of a cold. It's not COVID, I have tested, but I do apologise if I do sound a bit off, and I might need to use a tissue or have a drink as I go through my presentation, so apologise for that. As Joe mentioned, I'm one of the Violence Against Women, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence trainers at Welsh Women's Aid. I'm also a qualified independent sexual violence advisor. I have a collective about 10 years experience now, academically, practically working frontline with survivors of sexual violence, and then now moving into training. I'd like to thank WSAS for inviting us to speak, and we do feel privileged to be here today. For those of you who are maybe unfamiliar with Welsh Women's Aid and what we do, I'm just going to quickly introduce who we are. So Welsh Women's Aid is an umbrella organisation. We have 19 specialist violence against women, domestic abuse and sexual violence services across Wales. They're our members, of which several are dedicated sexual violence services, including WSAS North Wales, who I believe you heard speak yesterday about working with children who've survived sexual abuse. We also lobby for changes in legislation, both at the Welsh Government level and at Westminster, providing valuable insights and reports to enact real change. We also deliver the Live Fear Free Helpline, which Anne is going to talk about after my talk about sexual violence within the context of domestic abuse. And we support our members to embed quality practice through our national quality service standards. And we also provide training to specialist services and beyond to ensure all support provided to survivors is high quality and follows best practice. Jo has done a trigger warning in terms of please looking after yourself as you go through today. Just to do a little one before my presentation, that I am going to be reading out some survivor accounts throughout the speech that I'm doing today. They're all real and they're all within quotation marks, so they've been taken verbatim. The names have been changed to protect their identity, but I just, as Jo said, if at any point you feel uncomfortable, please do look to take care of yourself first and foremost. So we wanted to start today by just explaining what the definition of domestic abuse is, as not everyone is familiar with that. So the UK government-wide definition of domestic abuse is any incident, so it could be a one-off, or pattern of incidents, so more than one, of violence, abuse or conduct which controls, coerces or threatens between persons aged 16 or over who are or have been intimate partners or members of the same family, regardless of gender and sexuality. So that's talking about those who are in a relationship or ex-partners, so those who have been in a relationship but are no longer, or members of the same family. So that's, your mum's mum, dad, any children, that dynamic, regardless of gender and sexuality. So it doesn't matter who you are, how you identify. Everyone can experience domestic abuse or perpetrate domestic abuse. Today we're focusing, this speech specifically is going to focus on intimate partner violence, so sexual violence within that interpersonal relationship. So we're not going to be talking about family as much today. There are many different types of domestic abuse, which include but are not limited to, so you're probably familiar with these. So physical, psychological, emotional, sexual and financial and economic. There is lots of crossover within all of these and in sexual violence and all of these. They all link into each other, which we're going to look at in a moment. I just wanted to, again, because some of you may not be familiar with domestic abuse and how we speak about it in the sector. So when we talk about physical violence, we don't always mean, a big harm event. So it can be, and Dr. Evan Stark, who's a lead researcher in domestic abuse, he talks about low level, that's a direct quotation from him, and we don't mean that in terms of the impact on the survivor is low, but what we mean is the violence that is inflicted wouldn't normally be enough to warrant going to a hospital or coming into contact with the medical field. So things like shoving, kicking, pushing, biting, things that wouldn't lead to someone necessarily needing to go to A&E. So to just bear that in mind when you're working with survivors as well, is to get the mindset out of what you think a physical assault might be. Running along all five of the types of domestic abuse is coercive controlling behaviour, which is present in almost all cases of domestic abuse. And coercive control instills fear, dependence, compliance and shame, which prohibits the survivor from disclosing and potentially being able to leave that relationship. So thinking about sexual violence within intimate partner relationships, so it can be defined as any unwanted sexual contact or activity by an intimate partner with the purpose of controlling an individual through fear, threats or violence. And sexual violence within a relationship is rarely an isolated incident. It often occurs alongside other forms of abusive behaviour, for example, that's psychological and emotional abuse. Arguably, Where the sexual violence is physical, so we're not going to talk too much today about verbal types of abuse, but this it's not, sexual violence is not just physical acts done to the person's body. It's a lot wider than that. So arguably, where there is physical abuse, where it is sexual, the two are the same because it's a physical action that's being taken. Over half of women raped by an intimate partner were sexually assaulted multiple times. So often within domestically abusive relationships, we see multiple forms of sexual violence, but also repeated sexual violence. I'm going to click up some of the different forms that it might take and talk through them. So as we mentioned just now about coercive control being present in most domestically abusive relationship. So any and all sexual contact within a coercive controlling relationship is always a form of sexual violence, because survivors do not have the freedom, capacity or choice to give true consent. So under the law you need those three things to give true consent. However, survivors who were sexually abused within domestically abusive relationships often don't recognise or name it at the time as sexual abuse. Sometimes they don't realise until many years later or even post the relationship. So that is a mix of trauma, so both the brain blocking it out as they're in survival mode, but also myths around sexual violence. So the biggest being that if you're in a relationship with someone, or if you're married to someone, that your partner cannot sexually abuse you. They might mention it to a helpline or a domestic abuse worker at crisis point when they're reaching out for support, and it may be disclosed during the risk assessments that we do, but they often do not want to address the sexual assault at the time, even if they do disclose. Normally that's because domestic abuse survivors are more preoccupied with leaving the relationship as safely as possible, potentially having to move into refuge out of area, finding a new home, sorting finances, supporting children, being involved in legal systems. So if they've reported physical abuse, there may be criminal investigations there, or in terms of family court, there may be ongoing legal battles in there. So often the realisation that they've been sexually abused comes later, or they don't want to address it at the time, and therefore that need for support for that specific sexual abuse comes later as well. Obviously, rape, sexual assault and assault by penetration are common within domestically abusive relationships, as is sexual exploitation, where the partner may force their partner to have sex with other people for money, so in terms of forced prostitution, and or into taking naked photos or videos to be distributed for money, so things like cam work and selling of images. Separate to that, we have being pressured into taking naked photos, videos, or having them taken of them, and perpetrator is threatening to distribute or is distributing them for free. So they might show them to their friends or colleagues and things like that. That's known as image-based sexual abuse, which is sometimes also referred to as revenge porn. This can also happen after the relationship has ended. We have forced pregnancy, unconsensual condom removal, sometimes called stealthing, and not allowing or destroying birth control. Intentionally infecting their partner with sexually transmitted infections or sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV. If someone knowingly infects someone else with HIV, that is actually a criminal offence in the UK. They may force their partner to have abortions. They may force children to watch the sexual abuse or involve the children in some way in the abuse. They may use make-up sex as a tactic. And what we mean by make-up sex is that minutes or hours after an often sustained abusive incident, such as physical violence or psychological or emotional abuse, the perpetrator will instigate sex as a way of making up. This is often confusing, exhausting, and obviously abusive for the survivor. The survivor often feels like they can't refuse that make-up sex, as this can escalate the violence. And this can also be used by survivors as a risk management technique to help keep violence down, so to not allow it to escalate where possible. And just to remember that where there's seemingly consent, so where there may look like there's consent there from the perpetrator, that doesn't mean that consent has actually been given. Going back to what we know about, there's no freedom, choice or capacity, then they cannot give true consent. Transactional sex, so that's where there is giving and or receiving of gifts or money normally. So as an example, I've got a survivor quote there. She said, I'd say, oh, can you lend me £5, £10 just so I can put petrol in the car to get to work? And he'd make me give him oral sex and then he'd give me the money. Forced marriage, including child marriage. So of course, where there is no consent to the actual marriage, any sexual abuse that occurs within that marriage is also sexual violence. And then forced sexual contact with an animal is not uncommon as well. It's not an exhaustive list, and we've not obviously been able to go into any great depth. So if anyone is interested in discussing more about this, I'll pop my email in at the end. It's also worth mentioning that sexual violence is actually a high-risk indicator or marker for serious harm or murder. This is why it's asked on the risk assessment, and Jane Monckton-Smith includes it in her clusters of risk, that increased risk. So sexual violence. If you're speaking with someone who's disclosed that there is sexual abuse happening, but you need to be taking that extremely seriously in terms of risk management, because it can indicate that there may be an escalation into life-limiting injury or death. And just to remember that intimate partner sexual violence can occur in all types of intimate relationships, regardless of gender identities or sexual orientation. So the Scottish Transgender Alliance found that 80% of transgender people had experienced abuse from a partner, sexual abuse from a partner at some point over the course of their life. And gay, lesbian and bisexual people are more than twice as likely to suffer from sexual violence than their heterosexual counterparts. So I know you're going to look at LGBTQ+ experiences in more detail tomorrow as well. So I wanted to, so 30% of women experiencing intimate partner sexual violence have been subjected to sexual intercourse during which their partner started to become violent, including choking, being punched, spat at or injured on purpose during sex. And that's a statistic from Jessica Taylor, the 2021 research, which I can also link to if anyone's interested in reading that. And you can see on the screen a survivor account there. So she says, now at the start, I definitely said no, and I definitely never wanted it. I definitely never consented to it, and I always didn't like it. I was pregnant, I was tired, I was working, and I didn't want it. What would then happen would be violence towards me. It would start with strangulation, then move on to waterboarding, then moved on to being pulled around the house. Sometimes he used to pull me up by my hair so I didn't touch the floor. Ultimately, I learned not to say no, but I never said yes, and that's rape. You have been coerced into a situation where you are so scared to actually tell them what you want, because the outcome will be so much worse. So if you lay there thinking, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, then somehow you're justifying it in your brain. So the sad reality is that you take on the blame. So as a victim, you learn just to abide by what they want so that you don't get hurt. So it's worth mentioning that under the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, non-fatal strangulation or suffocation is now a criminal offence, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Use of non-fatal strangulation increases sevenfold the risk of being killed by a perpetrator and can often cause internal injury as well as the obvious terror, since it can imply a threat to kill. The common coercion tactics used by perpetrators within intimate partner relationships around sexual violence include threat. So that can look like, if you don't have sex with me, I'll tell everyone that you've been having an affair and you're an adulterer, which crosses over with that guilt in the survivor. If you don't do it, I will hurt you, the children, your family, your pet. So they might threaten to hurt someone else to coerce that person into the abuse. Emotional blackmail, so saying things such as, people in relationships have sex. If we aren't going to have sex, I think we should break up. Don't be a prude. Everyone else is having sex. You're too old to still be a virgin. You haven't wanted to have sex much lately. You must be cheating. If you aren't, then prove it to me by showing that you want me. You must not really love me as much as you say you do if you won't sleep with me. I've been feeling so lonely. I really need you right now. And sulking, ignoring, or not talking to the survivor when they don't get sex. So what we might call the silent treatment, but just completely ignoring them, acting like they don't exist, which can be extremely, dehumanizing for survivors as well. They might attack their self-esteem. So things like, you should feel grateful I'm here with you. I could sleep with anyone. You'd never know. You're no good in bed. You should be happy I even want to touch you. Quite classic insults. So you're so fat, you're so ugly, good luck finding someone else who wants to sleep with you. Badgering, so repeatedly asking for sex to wear the person down. And on the next slide we have another survivor account which kind of highlights the use of emotional blackmail, attacking self-esteem, badgering and guilt tripping. So she said, it was midnight and I was just dropping off to sleep when I felt a tap on my shoulder. The tap, as my boyfriend tried to come closer and whisper sweet nothings in my ear. But my exhaustion turned them bitter. Not tonight, I declared. I had all the standard excuses ready. We'd been fighting and my feelings were still hurt. Love wasn't currently a resident in our home. Little did I know love was about to move out. Not tonight. Why not? Why don't you ever want to have sex with me? You should be glad I'm not out there cheating. You're hardly Kate Moss. I watch porn, but that's not enough. I want you. My consistent refusals were each met with another battering of this sort, and my attempts to ignore him and go to sleep weren't working. Sleep deprivation is actually a form of torture. Keep someone up long enough, and they'll do just about anything for you to leave them alone. I didn't know that it was going to become a pattern, with him waking me up 2, 3, sometimes 4 times per night. So the last part of the presentation today was to talk a little bit about how what the approach that we advocate at Welsh Women's Aid to working with survivors. We call it a change that lasts approach, but some of you may be familiar with a different kind of name and title of it. There's 4 main pillars, so trauma-informed, needs-led, strength-based and empowering, which runs throughout all 3 of the others. So being trauma-informed means having an awareness of trauma as the foundation of an organisational culture of trauma-informed care. Begins with building awareness amongst staff and clients of the prevalence, impact and adaptations made to cope and survive after trauma. So we often talk about changing that approach from the what's wrong with you framework to the what happened to you framework. This includes knowing the common trauma responses, sometimes called symptoms within the medical field, within the medical model, and being able to confidently support the survivor with them. This means understanding that sexual violence may have happened, and just because they're not saying that it has right now doesn't mean that we shouldn't be aware of it when we're working or within our conduct with survivors. We must remember that trauma needs to be thought of as a continuum, and some individuals may be experiencing multiple types of trauma at the same time. So for a good example of that is you might be working with an adult survivor of, say, domestic abuse where there is a sexual abuse element, but that person may also have been sexually abused or physically abused in childhood. So it's always worth exploring with them about any other forms of abuse that they may have experienced across their life. So this includes understanding that trauma responses are rational, valid, understandable, common, justified and natural, and not abnormal or disordered. So really peeling back any judgment we might have around the type of trauma response or coping mechanism that makes sense to them, using empathy when we're speaking with them. Services must understand how trauma may impact the survivor's ability to consistently engage with the service and respond with empathy, compassion and understanding. So there was a report, Safe Lives did a report, and they told, and women told them that if they missed appointments, cases were often closed and they would need to be re-referred in. So their report concluded that, quote, non-engagement is therefore seen as a refusal of services, not a common response of mental health, trauma and complex needs, when sometimes attending appointments can feel overwhelming and frightening. So to remember that when we're working with survivors. And lastly, making sure that trauma-informed services demonstrate support for their staff, so signs of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue in staff as well. And I do have a recommended reading for this, which I'll pop in the chat after the talk. Needs-led, so important to understand each survivor seeking services is an individual and support should therefore be tailored and not one size fits all. Highlights a collaborative stance where people are the experts in their own lives and our practitioner's role is to increase and explain choices and encourage people to make their own decisions through informed choices. So as Dame Vera Bird said about letting them know the options available to them. Ensuring that we provide culturally competent and sensitive services. So understanding how the dynamics of abuse and subsequent needs may differ depending on groups that the survivor may belong to. For example, Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, LGBTQ+ survivors, disabled survivors, and so on and so on. Strengths-based work links very heavily into needs-led, but it recognises and builds on the current coping mechanisms, resistance strategies and resilience of the survivor. The survivor is supported to recognise and nurture the internal and external resources that they have at their disposal, which they can use to counteract any difficulty or condition. This obviously doesn't mean that there's no struggle. There's no struggle there. It's not like, oh, we're going to raise resilience and therefore there is no difficulty or condition, but it's about looking at all the different elements in a holistic way that will help that survivor moving on with their life. Strengths-based model fosters hope and supports the survivor to reflect on what they want to achieve, what techniques may have been successful for them in the past, and also allows us to get to the heart of the person, understand them individually, their individuality, strengths, wishes and priorities, which is done through meaningful conversations. And then, as I mentioned, along all three of the pillars is this empowering, which is helping to rebuild the confidence of the survivor, enabling them to represent their interests in a responsible and self-determined way, acting on their own authority, helping putting them back in control of their life. When you've not been allowed to make decisions, especially when we're talking about domestic abuse, oftentimes for months, years, decades, it can be very difficult to relearn how to trust their own judgments, their own wants, their own needs. So allowing them time to think about options and supporting them to do that is very empowering for them, and fostering their vision of what their life will be when they finish with services. And lastly, it's a reflective practice exercise. I'm not going to ask anyone's feedback, and it's not going to be a prolonged experience. What I'd like you to do is just, whilst I'm talking, have a read of the 5 on the left, the 5 points, and think about, when working with survivors of sexual trauma, do you do those 5 things? And think about, on a scale of 1, where 1 your knowledge and practice is poor, and 5 your knowledge and practice is excellent, where you would rate yourself. And depending on where you rate yourself should be where you might think about seeking out additional upskilling opportunities. Welsh Women's Aid, we have a dedicated training department, so we are available to provide training on a variety of topics relating to sexual violence and trauma, and I'll put my contact details up on the last slide. So thinking about acknowledging your own personal beliefs and biases about sexual violence, healthy sexuality and consensual sex. So we all grew up in a world where we're told different things by our parents, our friends, the media. So recognising first what our own beliefs around sexual violence are, healthy sexuality and consensual sex. Continually monitoring and challenging those beliefs. making sure that we respect and openness to survivors is grounded in our own self-awareness. Feel comfortable discussing sexual abuse and healthy consensual sexual relationships with all survivors, including male survivors and survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And also, as we mentioned, survivors from those different groups as well, in terms of intersectionality. If survivors see that you as a professional are uncomfortable or unapproachable, it only makes it harder for them to talk about what's happened and can prohibit disclosures. Make sure you understand a range of sexual terms and acts in both scientific terminology and common slang, including those related to the LGBTQ+ community and the disabled community as well. So different communities will engage in healthy sex and therefore sexual violence in different ways. So we need to be understanding of that if we're working with people from those communities. And understand the common trauma responses and use that the system that I spoke about. So that the trauma informed needs a strength-based and empowering approach. So Deoch, thank you so much for allowing us time today to talk with you. As you can see, I've put the email addresses up there. So my email address is and also the main training email address as well. And I'll pop them in the chat once I stop sharing. Thank you. I believe we'll go over to Anne now.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to talk to you today about the Live Fear Free helpline. I, like Maya, unfortunately have a bit of a cold. Again, I've tested this morning and I am not positive for COVID, so long may that remain. So I'm going to talk to you for the next 30 minutes about the work that we do at the Live Fear Free helpline. Llinell Gymorth byw heb ofn. And, you know, it's a privilege and an honour for me to manage this fantastic team of people who support victims and survivors when they really need to talk to somebody. And I think the title of the presentation that you've given me is the value of the helpline, and hopefully over the next 30 minutes I will talk to you about exactly what we offer, not only for the victim survivors but also for professionals and for people who are concerned possibly about their loved ones, friends, colleagues, etc. And I hope that I can demonstrate the value and worth of having this superb facility in Wales. I will also give a health warning, and things that I may say will be uncomfortable without a doubt. And these are things that I will have heard, you know, or seen written down as true accounts of what people have to suffer. And I actually came into this sector about 8 years ago, new, completely new. And I would never say that I was a naive person at all. But my goodness, have I had my eyes opened to this whole sector, what goes on, almost beggars belief. And I've, you know, if I was ever to write a book about what I've heard, then I would be hard pressed to know whether to file that book under fact or fiction. You think you've heard it all, and then there's more. And things can be really upsetting. You know, please feel free to switch off. I will leave my contact details if you want to contact me or anybody else from the Live Fear Free helpline. The second health warning I would like to give is I'm a woman and I'm Welsh and I like to talk, and I have a huge passion for the work that we all do in supporting victim survivors. So if we're still here, you know, it's about 5 o'clock, please feel free to move away and have your lunch. So I do hope that somebody's watching the clock for me. Yeah, and like I said, you know, I definitely had my eyes wide open to this whole sector once I started working for Welsh Women's Aid. And I think there's a little bit of a belief in Wales, you know, possibly the rural communities that we live in, that it's not a problem for us. It's that Achabi term, isn't it? You know, it happens somewhere else. It's in somebody else's city. It's not in our own, you know, Welsh speaking rural communities. They are. these issues are there in everybody's community, you know, in everybody's home. We have to be mindful. It's not something that happens purely in London and Birmingham and Liverpool and Leeds. It is here in Wales, very much alive in our own small communities. And the Live Fear Free helpline, you know, is, as the title says, we should all be able to live our lives free from fear. But unfortunately, for many people, this is not the case. So the Live Fear Free helpline is a 24/7, 365-day-a-year service, and it's managed by Welsh Women's Aid, but wholly funded by the Welsh Government. So there's always somebody there, day or night, to listen. We are accessible via telephone, web chat, text and email. And we offer these forms of accessibility because it's really difficult for people to make these disclosures. People test us for sure. They come on, they want to see what we're about, what can we offer. We see some people come, you know, through on that first disclosure, possibly by text, because they're able to type in how they're feeling, what's going on at home. They may find it really difficult to verbalise and vocalise. How do you put into words what's going on at home? You know, the person that should take care of you, look after you, love you, is doing these awful things. How do you tell somebody? How do you tell a stranger? Sometimes it's easier to type it in. I've listened to calls where, you know, for 35, possibly out of a 40-minute call, somebody has cried, and that's all right. Somebody's plucking up courage to tell us, and hopefully after that first disclosure, it's, you know, it becomes easier then to talk more freely about what's going on, and knowing that somebody is there listening, believing and not judging. Those are the three things that people ask of us. Telephone is still the most common way that people choose to make that contact. Yeah, and like I said, we have somebody there day and night, and we work to a 95% strike rate. So our calls have to be picked up 95 times out of 100, not go into voicemail. So we know that somebody there, when somebody, you know, is reaching out, possibly at 3 in the morning in crisis, there's always going to be somebody there. We offer support to all victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence, be that current abuse or past. So it's absolutely everything, the whole remit of both domestic abuse and sexual violence. And we do know that they are interlinked, but we also deal with the standalone sexual abuse and sexual violence. We offer a bilingual service with instant access to language line. So all our helpline advocates are Welsh speakers, but we also, like I say, we can offer instant access. We don't have to book the services of an interpreter. They are there immediately. And what we find is we would never encourage anybody to try and carry on with the conversation when we pick up straight away that they have broken English. It's a way of missing out crucial bits of what they're trying to tell us. Things do get lost in translation, so we would always endorse that our advocates, helpline advocates, would use the services of an interpreter in those cases. We really don't ask for anybody to involve friends or family in making, acting on behalf of that person, and definitely not children. Children should not be privy to that conversation. We do sometimes have to, again, reinforce, that all interpreters have been vetted, that they do have to work within the confines of confidentiality and GDPR. People possibly from the BME communities may think that the interpreter may be known to them and will talk about them to their communities, but we have obviously tried, to enforce the idea that that won't happen. We offer a safe, confidential and anonymous space in which to talk, and again, that's really important. People who contact us don't have to tell us who they are or where they're calling us from, and sometimes that allows them to be extremely honest with us. They don't see us as a statutory organisation who may be knocking on their door. Obviously, again, we have to work within the confines of the safeguarding protocol, but to a large degree, we allow people to tell us, exactly what's going on. And to that end, I have actually seen a case of a risk assessment. So we do the CARDA-DASH, the risk assessment toolkit. And I saw a case where a woman had actually done one of these risk assessments with the police and had scored 8. Now, 14 is what we look for as a consideration for serious risk of harm or possible homicide. And 8, just kept that woman under the radar. Now, when we reassessed, she was very honest and she scored an 18. Now, that's a huge jump. The enormity of what was happening to that woman would have been lost with one organisation. But, again, with that availability of that safe anonymous space to possibly disclose more, we were able then to tell her about the risk that she was at. There's a duty of care once somebody scores over 14 to explain fully, how that could pose a serious risk of harm. So yeah, affording that safe space. And if needs be, again, we can trace calls and we can trace web chats. So yeah, there is that, affording of that safe space. However, if we suspect that anybody is in danger or the children within that household are in danger, then we will involve the police. And actually, I was on call last night and had something, a call from one of my workers who was dealing with a woman on web chat who had disclosed something extremely serious and didn't want the police involved. But again, we had to balance the danger to the families as a whole, as a unit, and where she thought that she was able to keep herself safe. There was, the evidence that the children were unsafe was overwhelming, and yes, we had to involve the police, and that was again at 1 o'clock this morning. We are backing the trend a little bit as a helpline in that we are a national helpline and we're based up in North Wales. And it is just one helpline. People tend to think, especially when they come to visit, because we are a small office, to say that we offer a 24-hour service. We don't have a satellite office. Obviously, Welsh Women's Aid, the headquarters in Cardiff, and we have huge support from head office, but we are a standalone helpline up in the north, and we don't have satellite offices anywhere else. Obviously, we link in with a whole host of other organisations. We can't work in isolation. And as we are a pan-Wales organisation, we have a database of all available provision throughout all counties and beyond. I mean, we do get calls from across the borders. The first question that we ask people who make contact with us is, are you safe? Not where are you calling us from? Because, anybody reaching out to us, we would deem worthy of that support. So we would not ask as a first question as to, who are you, where you're from? And try and signpost to the relevant organisation within their own countries. We would offer that support because we acknowledge how difficult it is to pick up the phone and try to make that first disclosure, and obviously very much aware of what we call the golden moment. that person may have a very limited window of opportunity to make that disclosure. So we work to the ethos of not turning anybody away. And when I talk about the database, you know, we have all the available provision that's offered throughout Wales, and this database is updated twice yearly just to check that the details we have are still correct. We don't like to give information that may be out of date. We also know that a lot of pilots spring up. Funding, you know, are for limited periods of time. So again, we try to check up and make sure that those pilots may be still running, or that, you know, other things have come up in their place. We also, as a helpline, manage routes to support. This used to be called UK Refugees Online, and we manage the Wales aspect of this database. We update this database on a daily basis. So at 10:30 every day, if all the domestic abuse services throughout Wales haven't updated their availability of refuge spaces, then we follow up from the helpline. Again, we like to think that the information we're giving out is current and up to the minute. Anybody looking to, you know, flee an abusive relationship needs to know that the information we're giving is correct at that moment, not only for the victim survivor, but also for the professionals who may be advocating on their behalf. We work in partnership with many organisations throughout Wales, and obviously this is to offer best resolution support and the start of recovery. You know, we all have to work together, and I think I would just make the analogy of us all offering that safety blanket. People are handing themselves over to us, possibly when they're at their lowest. This may be years of domestic abuse and sexual violence, and today is the day that they've decided to tell somebody. You know, they need to know that they can hand themselves over to somebody, like I said, who will listen, believe, not judge, and then, you know, what do we do thereafter? That phone call may be the start of either changing somebody's life or saving somebody's life. And when, you know, when we interview for new staff at the helpline, that is the way I sell the job. This is life or death, you know, and that's not me being dramatic. We know that people who phone us may unfortunately be victims of domestic homicide, but we will do as much as we can at that point, either to point out the danger that they're in, to try and seek refuge, try and signpost for onward referral, but just leave the door open. You know, whatever they're telling us, that we leave that door open for them to come back to us. Making that first disclosure, you know, when you've suffered 40, 50 years of domestic abuse, you're not going to be telling everything on that first disclosure. So it's about leaving the door open, you know, come back to us. We are here 24/7. And, you know, some of the things that we hear, like I said, absolutely beggars belief, but it's about offering that reassurance. You know, it doesn't matter what you tell us, we can offer support by working together. So the direct working partnerships that we have throughout Wales are with many organisations. So we deal with the ambulance service, so any ambulance personnel who will go to an incident of domestic abuse or sexual violence will promote the services of the helpline. And if that person wants a direct referral made into us, then the ambulance personnel will gather the details and then make that direct referral into the helpline. It means, in a way, that we then call that person back and they don't have to go over, you know, what's happened. We've got a brief overview. So it's about taking it from there. What we don't want really is to re-traumatise that person. We also we have a direct working partnership with South Wales Police. We make direct referrals into the sexual violence agencies throughout Wales, and again to the same parameters. You know, we give a brief overview, so we listen to what somebody's telling us, and then we offer at the end of that call, you know, would you like us to refer you on for either face-to-face support as a counsellor or to partake of any of the programmes that the fantastic sexual violence agencies throughout Wales offer. And that is RASAC, Stepping Stones, New Pathways and Horizon. And we do know again that obviously during the pandemic, possibly at the beginning of the pandemic, it was difficult for people to come out and talk. But now we are finding, you know, when, I don't want to use the term normality because I think we're a far way from that, but when people are more free to talk, I think we are finding now that, you know, what's happened over the last 2 years has manifested itself in such a way that people now think, yes, you know, this is what's been happening to me and I need to talk to somebody, so we can make those onward referrals. And again, you know, when somebody's spoken to us for, you know, 45 minutes, we give a brief overview of that call to the sexual violence agencies. So they've got some idea of what they're going to be dealing with. And obviously, the, you know, as Welsh Women's Aid as well, we have the domestic abuse services that are dotted throughout Wales. We get to see, you know, what provision they're able to offer. Do they have a child worker? Do they have drop-ins? Do they have, you know, CAB going in? Do they have legal support? So again, we're able to signpost for onward face-to-face support. The indirect referrals, again, that we use our database for is a myriad of different organisations. We know that domestic abuse and sexual violence is almost like an umbrella term, and what comes out of, you know, that whole experience of you know, the awful things that goes on within these settings is then a minefield for people to try and work through. Self-esteem, you know, self-confidence will have been eroded over years. There's the mental health issues that we know at the moment, you know, are so compounded as to what's happened over the last 2 years. We know that people have huge problems with debts because of domestic abuse. We have to liaise with local authorities, social services, housing, legal, child contact, eating disorders, substance misuse, self-harm. So what comes out as a result of domestic abuse is a minefield of different experiences. And again, we have to be mindful and not to judge. You know, substance misuse, we know victim survivors turn to substances as a coping mechanism. Who are we to judge? If it's a way for that person to get through the day, then we cannot be judging that person. We also work with the Revenge Porn Helpline, huge, you know, such a supportive organisation. And again, you know, unless we know about these organisations, then we're not making the appropriate signposting referrals. And who contacts us? Well, it is obviously the victim survivors themselves. And again, I've spoken about, you know, who these people are. They can be young people, possibly who are witnessing what goes on within their own families. They could be young teens who are starting out in relationships and may feel that the relationship they're in is not healthy and will phone us. Possibly they know that is not a healthy relationship because they've chosen to phone the Live Fear Free helpline. It's almost like they're looking for somebody to galvanise, you know, possibly what they're beginning to understand anyway. It could also be somebody who is wanting to manage a situation, so they're not looking to leave that relationship, but how can I manage this relationship safely? How can I stay within this home? Don't want to leave yet, I am planning to do so, but I just wanted to keep me and my children safe for now. We get the older people, more of these are coming through, and people tend to think, you know, it's because there's an illness, dementia possibly. It's not always the case. There could have been domestic abuse, sexual violence over many, many years, but now is the time that this person is speaking out. We had a woman who phoned us in her 80s. She phoned us at 3 in the morning looking for refuge space. You know, what courage does it take? She was married at 16, but in her 80s is looking for refuge space. It's with great sadness that you listen to these calls, because you just think, you know, had they reached out earlier, what quality of life could they have had? We also obviously get calls from concerned others. So these are friends, family members, colleagues, employers, neighbours, anybody who has concerns about a loved one, has either tried to broach the subject or is looking, you know, to support but not quite sure what to do. How do I do this safely? How do I do this without isolating my daughter? You know, so there's a lot that goes on. There's a lot that we can tell people. We also hear about hairdressers, you know, more and more, because we know that hairdressers now are being drawn into training. Great training being offered, because we know that somebody sits, you know, with a hairdresser. You possibly go to the same hairdresser, you know, over many, many years. There's a comfort about sitting, talking to that same person, you know, every 6 weeks or 2 months. But we are promoting now that hairdressers are empowered and educated enough to actually ask the question, you know, in an obviously diplomatic and safe way. They are there, they can see the hair pulling, they can possibly see marks on the neck, people coming in appropriately dressed. You know, why do you go to the hairdresser in August and you've got a puller neck jumper on? So it's about empowering people to possibly ask the questions as well, and not to be scared of the answer. The Live Fear Free helpline is there. You know, we tell hairdressers, feel, you know, empowered enough to ask the question, but don't panic when you hear the answer. We've got our cards, you know, if you've got a room somewhere that you can put that person in. We did actually hear about a hairdresser who was so concerned about, you know, what she saw as marks on the client's face, that she asked her, you know, what was going on, and they actually got that person into refuge on that day, because she said, I can't, you know, I can't go home. This is what's going on. This is why I've got marks on my neck. And it's about just keeping that composure and just knowing that you're not alone. So we do hear job centre staff as well. We've heard this happen, CAB staff who, you know, are empowered and educated enough to know, right, if I phone the Live Fear Free helpline, this is what they're going to be able to offer me. And professionals. So again, we have professionals who contact us either in their day-to-day role, or if what they've heard has been so upsetting that they're unable to get rid of that, you know, feeling of hopelessness or disbelief, unable to go to sleep. They're carrying that around with them. They're waking up in the morning, they're thinking about what they saw, what they heard, or have also triggered something that may have happened or is still happening, you know, in their own lives. We're all human beings, you know, we all go through processes. It's not just about the people that come through our doors, it's about us, it's about our colleagues. So we should never think that we are invincible. I've just been part of a domestic homicide review, and I found myself having to offload to my own staff, because I was finding myself waking up in the morning thinking about this young woman, and she was the last person that I thought of at night. So again, it's about look after yourselves. if we can't look after ourselves, we can't support others effectively. Now, sexual violence, obviously, we hear, you know, either within the domestic abuse setting or things that may have happened as standalone incidents. We hear of people who talk to us years, you know, after an assault. We hear about people who may have been in college 10 years ago and they've seen something on the news, or there's a storyline in a soap and they think, that's me. I have never spoken to anybody about this before. I've put it in a box, I've forgotten about it, but now I need to talk to somebody. So yes, we hear sexual violence and sexual abuse almost can be the two sides of the same coin. So we hear about things like he makes me dress in clothes that are 2 or 3 sizes too big for me because he doesn't want me to be attractive to anybody else. But the flip side of that is somebody who comes through and says, I am made to dress in overtly sexual clothing. Really don't like it. It's about power and control. It's about degradation. I can do with you what I want. You are my property. So again, we hear about, you know, Maya spoke about rape within marriage, very, very common calls at the helpline. You know, rape is rape, whether it's within that relationship or not. We also hear a lot of people phone us and it's almost like they're apologising. You know, I know you deal with, you know, rape and things. This may be a little bit lower level. Nothing is lower level if it's causing that person distress. And again, we've heard about the inappropriate touching, the groping. You know, we've heard about people being groped on public transport. And again, it's a young woman comes to mind on public transport on the tube in London. She was a student from Wales and she was inappropriately groped. She felt that people on that carriage turned a blind eye to her. And, you know, years later, she attempted suicide. She wouldn't go out of the house. She gave up her studies. So it's not lower level, you know, and also the name calling, you know, yes, people tend to think, oh, it's banter, it's insignificant. If it's causing harm or distress, and again, if it's prolonged, then it's not lower level. And again, you know, I've heard, you know, quite common where people say, yes, you know, that this person said to me, you know, you look great in those jeans, and just inappropriately looking or making those comments. But when that person is called out, it can turn really nasty. You know, then it becomes, well, I only said that because really you're ugly and I was wanting to make you feel good about yourself, and how damaging those comments can be, especially to somebody who may have self-confidence anyway. So they're not lower level. And this is what we try and endorse to people. If it's distressing to you, then obviously, is that my 5 minutes? Okay, great. Yeah, so I will end, you know, the pandemic has seen a huge spike, obviously, in our calls. We're on about 700 contacts a week, which is huge. Yeah, but I am available if anybody wants me to deliver, you know, awareness sessions to your teams. You know where I am. Thank you. Diolch.
Fab, thank you, Anne, and sorry to pop up there where you were mid-flow. Fantastic presentations from thank you, Maya and Anne, brilliant, you know, educating us on domestic abuse and how sexual violence can be reported later and what needs to be done to deal with that, and then all your experience, Anne, with the Live Fear Free helpline, which is an amazing resource for people in Wales. Yeah, just really educational, fantastic. Thank you. We've had a couple of questions that have been put in the chat bar. I think so. I have been half following them, so I think that some of them have been answered as we're going. So there were some particular questions. Are we happy to deal with the questions in the chat.
I've had a little look. Yeah, Vicky seems to have covered that specific one really well.
Fantastic.
Obviously, I'm going to be here for the whole conference. I know Anne has to pop out, so if any other questions, you know, do come in specifically for us, and I can answer them at some point as well.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. What we'll do now then, if Gary's happy to come in and do her presentation now, I'll delay the break by a little bit and go straight into Gary's presentation. Are you happy to do that, Gary?
I'm here, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. So Gary is a survivor advocate for, and I've got to pronounce it right, Sutter org, and she's going to be talking to us today about her experiences. Thank you.
Can't get my camera on. Is that on purpose or?
I'm not sure. Katrina, can you?
Yeah, Gary, you should be able to turn it on.
It won't allow me to. Is this something I'm not doing?
Bear with me 1 second, I'll just have a look.
Okay.
Sorry, we'll just fill for a minute. Bear with us.
Do you think I should just go out and come back in?
Yes, I think that's best because you are able to present from our end.
Okay. In a minute.
Thanks, Gary. Just to say that Gary is going to be sharing her personal experiences. So again, another trigger warning, which I'm sure Gary will say when she comes back in. But we you know, feel free to leave if what you're hearing is effects of triggering. And we do have, I think it is everywhere, and all of the chat that I've seen, the Live Fear Free helpline that Anne was just discussing. If anybody needs it at any point during or after the session today. There you go. Hi, Gary.
Sorry for taking so long.
It's okay, no problem. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for allowing me to speak today. May I also apologise for those moments when I might wobble a bit. One of the things I've learnt post-separation is how to cry and how it is not a weakness but a strength. So please don't think that I'm falling apart, but rather that I'm exerting strength. So let me tell you a bit about my background. I come from a society that has little to do with domestic violence. It's well heeled, it's well educated, it's well homed, and well honed in Debrett's correct form, I suppose. I became a British citizen in 1975. I'm the granddaughter of a female doctor and a male minister. I'm the daughter of 2 Indian doctors who are experts in their fields. And my father told me that I should do well to fit in with this society and do as well as the next girl, if not better, and make this society proud of me. So I studied hard and achieved well at school and university. And unfortunately, my father passed away when I was 17, so sadly didn't get to appraise my achievements. But I have no doubt that he would have been incredibly proud of me. He was a very good man who encouraged me to be the best that I could be. And even when I was naughty, he used to say, be the best naughty. So I moved up to Edinburgh to work, and I met a wonderful Scotsman with the most amazing blue eyes and the kindest heart imaginable. And he also encouraged me to be the best that I could be, naughtiness included. And so I married him, and together we had a mortgage in suburbia, 2 cars, a beautiful daughter, 2 dogs and a cat. So apart from the odd family skeleton in the closet, like any normal family, it was a good, privileged, relatively trauma-free upbringing, nothing to do with domestic abuse. My husband died in my arms when my daughter was 3 years old from cancer. I'm very lucky. I have a strong Christian faith, and using it, I focused everything on my little girl. And fast forwarding 10 years, she achieved a scholarship to a very good school. And I am without doubt that her grandfather and father would have been very proud of her too, more so probably as she was never as naughty as I was. It was then that I met a widower, a tall, dark, handsome widower with a gloriously sexy Italian accent. And he was looking for someone to tutor his small child. So I did. And everyone was happy for us. And I loved seeing everyone happy, for up until then, people had looked at me with that pained look that you give a young widow with a young child. And it wasn't how I wanted to be looked at or measured by. I had made friends with my grief, and I learned to live with it, but it seemed that society hadn't. But suddenly that all changed now, and I saw smiling eyes looking at me instead of pained care and concern. He bought me a dishwasher so that I could spend more time with him. He took me to a well-known lingerie boutique and spent an absolute fortune on gorgeous but slightly itchy lacy underwear. He cooked for me the most delicious pastas and pizzas, and he was attentive to my every need, my absolute soulmate. So I remortgaged my little cottage, which was my late husband's legacy, and we moved into a bigger detached house with 2 cars, 3 children, 2 dogs, and the cat. He took me to Egypt, and on a cruise down the Nile under a romantic setting sun, he proposed to me with a ring made from Egyptian gold. 4 months later, on our first family holiday to an island in the Mediterranean, he threw me across the living room of our apartment, screaming that I was flirting and behaving like a whore. I had been dancing with the children in the kiddies' discos, and apparently all the other men were looking at me. Well, I was totally confused and had no idea why men would want to look at my dancing, because if you ask any of my friends, that they will tell you that my dancing looks like I'm fending off a wasp. And I said to him, "You don't get to do that again," because I was quite feisty, and I gave him his engagement ring, packed my bags and went to book the next flight off the island for my daughter and I. Well, the next morning, the ash cloud from some volcano erupted, and we were stuck on that island for the next 7 days, during which time he wooed me again, crying and apologizing. I forgave him, and I put the ring back on. And we returned home, but it wasn't the same. There were times when I would reach for his hand and he would pull it away, or where he would turn over in bed with his back to me, and I would ask what's wrong, but it would be met with silence. I figured he was still smarting over our little fracas on the island, and I started feeling guilty and trying to make it up to him. The more I tried to reach him, the more he seemed to push me away, and it was like a drug. I needed to be loved by him. And when he did reach back for me, it was so comforting and reassuring, and it made me feel amazing. And then came the shoves, the slaps, the thumps, no serious physical damage, but mentally I was consumed with wanting to please him. When it happened, which wasn't so often at first, his eyes would turn the most frightening shade of the deepest black that you've ever seen. And sometimes when I held his face in my hands, trying to frantically kiss away the impending rage, it was as if I were looking into the eyes of the very devil itself. I know now that he was mentally dehumanizing me so that he could carry out what he wanted to do. I believed that I would be able to fix it all with love. I believed that I could help him overcome whatever it was that he was fighting inside. Each time it was as if he was pushing against my boundaries, and every time I would move my boundaries back a little. And then he started to convince me that it was all my fault in very clever, sinister ways. And there was no time to think and weigh up things. Somewhere inside of my head, I knew that he had messed with my mind, but there was no time to analyze, because then other stuff would happen. You see, it was me who was guilty of disturbing the equilibrium, the status quo. I am now a Methodist preacher, and he said that was not right. Women shouldn't hold position within the church because it says so in the Bible. I can assure you that it doesn't. He was tired from doing the majority of the housework. Surely I could take on more chores. So I did. Surely I could do the shopping on the way home from work. So I did. Surely I could cook more. So I did. There was no time to address the fact that he didn't work and was at home all day doing nothing while I worked full time. I was chopping carrots and one fell onto the floor, and I picked it up and flipped it back into the pot of boiling water, and I suddenly felt as if my teeth and my nose were going to explode because he had whacked me on the back of my head with one of those large pepper mills, and he was screaming accusations at me of trying to poison him and the children. I was a psychopath, a bad mother. I don't really like carrots now. When shopping on my way back from work, he rang me and said, "Can you pick up some bananas?" And I got home. "Why did you buy bananas?" "Well, because you asked me to." "No, I didn't. You just want to waste money. You know I don't eat bananas." And he threw the bananas into the bin. Well, I went after them to rescue them. And he emptied the bin onto the kitchen floor and said, "Pick it up with your teeth." So I did, because I didn't want the children to come in and witness this side of their father. I don't really like bananas now. Everything was quick and dealt with at the time. I became efficient in dealing with the episodes, so efficient. And efficiency led to excuses or lies. And in the past, victims have been accused of lying. And this is not untrue, but it is unfair because the lies are not what you think. The lies were not there to blame or attract attention. They were there to hide and keep people away. They were lies for survival, such as, "I went out last night and had one glass too many and I fell." The number of times that I used that excuse, I'm surprised my colleagues didn't suggest rehab for me. People noticed that I wasn't as happy-go-lucky, that I was always rushing off home, that I never went out with them. I told the lie that he loved me so much that he just wanted me to sit beside him all the time on the sofa in the evenings, watching those Steven Seagal movies. Well, I learnt to knit, so I didn't have to watch the movies. And the children were adorned in some spectacular articles of woolen clothing, which I noticed, by the way, they never wore outside of the house. He controlled me beautifully, and in hindsight it replays as some horrific, macabre dance. My love for my dogs. I've always had dogs, and he knows how much I adore them. Suddenly he wanted them to stay outside in the outhouse, as he felt it wasn't healthy for his children. I was absolutely horrified. One of my dogs was very elderly, and it was freezing outside. "He will die," I said. And I became a wicked woman who put her love for her dogs before the human family. He suggested that I sleep in the outhouse with the dogs to keep them company for a while until they got used to it. So I did. I did it to keep the peace. And he was kind enough to set up a blow-up bed and a heater in there. And we arranged that I would get back in before the children woke so they wouldn't know. 2 nights later, a neighbour saw me emerging from the outhouse in my pyjamas. I became adept at fantastic excuses. The neighbour didn't ask any more, and he let me sleep in the house with the dogs. But the dogs became a source of argument and sadness all the time. Of course, it was my fault, and he pushed and pushed at it until I rang the vet and told another lie about family circumstances and not being able to keep my dogs. An appointment was made, and a few days later I found myself backing down the drive with my beloved dogs in the car, sobbing and shaking so much I could hardly hold the steering wheel. And he came out and he stopped me, and he made a magnanimous gesture of agreeing to keep the dogs in the house, saying that I had passed his test and proved myself. And you know what? In that moment, he became my hero. He had saved me from absolute heartbreak. He had saved me from doing something really bad. He had saved me from myself. A year later, both dogs were dead. The vet said it was ground glass in raw meat. The police said the raw meat had probably been thrown over the side wall, but there was no proof. He seemed to enjoy my tears. And once he said, "You look so pretty when you cry." I stopped crying on the outside. He said I was mentally ill because sometimes I would fight back, talk back, swear, or throw things to try and stop him. And once I bent his finger back when I was trying to prise his hands off my throat during sex. And he claimed that I abused him. By the way, it was not sex, for isn't sex a two-way consent process on all aspects involved in the act? He told me now that I was as good as married to him. I was supposed to submit to him. He showed me the passage in the Bible from Colossians where it says, "Wives, yield to your husband." I know now the original Greek meaning of the word yield means to stand by, to assist, commend, and learn about, and it is asked of both man and woman. As I said, I didn't know about that at the time. What I did know is that some things are private between you and your man, things that go on behind closed doors, and no matter how shameful, you do not talk about them in public. So I didn't say about the many nights I was woken up by his needs. It was incredibly disorientating and distressing to be woken up in such ways, torture really, where I could not even be safe in my dreams. Another lie to my GP about sex that had got a little out of hand, tad on the rough side. My GP smiled and suggested an inflatable ring while the tears healed. Life became an expertly choreographed play where what was represented on the outside world was almost the exact opposite of what went on behind closed doors. Although it wasn't all the time, so it couldn't be domestic abuse, could it? I didn't always have a black eye or a bruised cheek or rib. There were nice times when we'd go for walks as a family, where family would come and visit. We'd go to the cinema, ice skating, holidays, and the children appeared happy. They didn't have a clue as to what was going on. At least that's what I thought. My daughter, my incredibly intelligent and beautiful daughter, began to drop grades at school. She said it was because she was being bullied. And the school said, "We don't have bullying here." She went from an A-star student to bordering on problem child and was referred to a psychiatrist at CAMS. He insisted on attending her first few sessions with her, telling me that he was really concerned and wanted to help. And the psychiatrist let him and listened attentively as he told him about how intensely troubled she was and how she was turning me into a neurotic mother and how he was so concerned, all the while commanding sympathy for how hard it all was for him, the doting stepfather trying his best to help. And they believed him. He set the story. When I tried to say that that was just not the case, the psychiatrist referred to me as a vocal mother and suggested that my daughter get a job in a well-known burger bar in order to become less entitled. I felt as though my voice had been taken away. No one would believe me. I didn't have the words to put them in the correct order to explain what was happening. And it seemed that the more I tried to speak, the more I was gagged by this society. I knew nothing about this world and I didn't know what to do. To anything I said, I was met with, "Think of the good things. How lucky are you for a second chance?" And "Boys will be boys." 2 years later, my beautiful daughter disclosed to her school teachers such things that meant that she too would have benefited from an inflatable ring. It was too late. And the psychiatrist's report stated that she was spoilt and known to tell lies. The same psychiatrist who allowed him to sit in on her sessions and tell his story first. She wasn't lying about being bullied, but no one thought to ask her who it was that was bullying her. It was April, and he'd just been to see his family for a month, leaving me and the children at home. It was peaceful and quiet, and I was able to sleep without being woken up to his sexual needs. I noticed how quiet the house was. It was as if his presence was creepily, silently full of noise. When he wasn't there, it was just quiet. You could hear the clocks ticking. He had been back 3 nights, and he was accusing me of having had someone else in the house. He said I smelled different. Something inside me just flipped. I was no longer myself, and in hindsight, I wonder if I was depressed. I suddenly didn't care about what he would do to me, and I said, "You cannot treat me like this." And he laughed, and I repeated it again. He kept laughing, and I just kept repeating the same words over and over, like a tape on loop. And he started getting angry, and the laughter started turning into snarls, and he got up, shoved me, and I couldn't stop repeating the words, "You cannot treat me like this," slapping, punching, and then as I went down, kicking. This time the children heard and came running. They saw him laying into me and ran to the neighbours for help. It was the neighbours who called the police, and a couple of months later, he was convicted and sentenced for what he did on that night. Even though he was criminally convicted, he continued his abuse financially and through family court, accusing me of many things completely unfounded. But once he reported them, I found myself suffering the indignity of social service investigations. I was totally ashamed, and even though those investigations came to nothing, the shame went deep. He spread rumours which came back to me through friends. And how many of them came to me and said, "He's really sorry, he's really sad." I lost a few friends along the way. It takes 2 to tango, they said. And you're far too bolshy and educated and confident to have allowed that to happen. I lost a lot of my dignity as I engaged with social services, the police, the SARC, which is the Sexual Abuse Referral Centre. My beautiful daughter started to close down, self-harming through alcohol, drugs, piercings, tattoos. The day she turned 16, which was literally 3 months later, she was turned away from CAMS, no longer a child. No one wanted to pick up the pieces. It was too horrific. The ones who offered came at a horrendous price. I simply didn't have the money because in the midst of all this breath-holding horror, I signed away nearly everything to him, including my late husband's legacy. I just wanted rid of him. His solicitors, in an amazing show of compassion, prevented him from taking it all. And to top it all, I had to go cap in hand to the food bank for a short while. My father's words of "make this society proud of you" hung round my neck as a medallion of guilt and shame. I'm not a diminutive Asian woman, a phrase once used to describe me by a police person who attended on that night. Nearly 10 years later, I have a lovely little home, which is mortgaged, food on my table. I also have 3 beautiful dogs and a cat. I support teenagers leaving the care system. I have an amazing rock gospel choir. As a Methodist preacher, I lead the White Ribbon Service for the Methodist Church. I am proud to be trustee of SUTTA, which is Stand Up to Domestic Abuse, the CEO of which is Rachel Williams, a strong and beautiful sister who survived what should have been a fatal shooting by her ex. We speak out, we train professionals and victims, and we raise awareness and hope in this horrendous world of domestic violence. I also find time to volunteer as team leader for the food bank. I'm co-founder with a lovely man called Mark of Wicked, What Can I Do? A company which specialises in training and raising awareness of Vowed SV amongst men. I have PTSD about so many things: letterboxes, peppermills, carrots, bananas, lacy knickers, and many other things. And I have a partner companion who is reminding me that there are good men in the world. I tell my story not because I want to cause sensation or seek revenge. This is not about my perpetrator, much as he would like it to be. This is about strength and courage, the strength and courage that is within all of us, the strength and courage that we often don't know we have until we need it. And sadly, this kind of abuse and violence has gone so deeply into our veins of society that any remedy that we offer also needs to go that deeply into those veins. Because this society has nurtured an ethos that is governed by the sweet fluidity of legal verbosity and political correctness, and the outcomes of which are marked by influential power. And today, this power is held by the male majority. This society must understand that power lies not in the hand of the one who holds it up, but in the hand of the one who gives it away to empower others. So I ask you, please use your power, for we all here hold power, and listen to understand. For all too often in this world, we listen to reply and not to understand. My daughter is still struggling. She doesn't trust anyone. Do you blame her? She has major issues. This once beautiful 14-year-old with a promising future lives in a closed, dark world, one where she says she's waiting for death. She's 26, and I haven't seen her or heard from her for nearly 6 months. I speak for her and all the women out there who have suffered from WSAS. It is a sad fact that there will be some listening right now who know these horrors only too well, and they may be too scared to come forward, or they may be in denial. My words to them are to seek out that strength which does lie in you somewhere, to take that first step. Talk to us, talk to survivors, talk to all the partnerships that are here. Talk to me, talk to someone, ask questions. And it is my prayer that others of you here will be given a thought, an idea of what you can do. Maybe gather together colleagues and seek out what you can do. There is information out there, plenty of it, about what you can do, but you must do something. For silence is not an option. Looking away is not an option. It is time to start bringing this pandemic to an end. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for speaking to us today. Your story is very emotive, and for sharing it with us and to help with the awareness raising and everything. All I can say is, the comments say it all. Thank you. You're a strong, amazing, courageous woman, and we're really happy that you could share your experiences with us today. And I think that the phrase I'm taking away from that today is silence isn't an option, and there are lots of agencies out there that people can get help from, and get awareness and share their stories with, in order for people to get help if they are faced by similar circumstances as you did. So thank you. And I think there's lots of comments in the bar. I'm not going to read them all, but thank you. I think that what we'll do now, following that, is we'll take a break, and give us a chance to read all the chat. And again, just to say, if there is anybody affected, as I've seen in the chat, that there are a couple of comments to say that some of the participants in today's event are affected by by Gary's story. Please get help, contact services, and we've put the Live Fear Free helpline up. So if everybody can take a 10-minute comfort break now, please. Actually, we'll make it a 15-minute. We'll come back at 11 o'clock, and we'll recommence then. Thank you, everybody. Hi everybody, and welcome back to the second half of our event today. I hope everybody's had a chance to grab a cup of something and take a comfort break. We're going to be starting the second half of our event with new pathways. So I am very proud to introduce Mike Wilkinson, who's the Deputy Chief Exec, and Debbie Woodruff, who's the Head of Training and Research. And they're going to be presenting today on rape and sexual abuse awareness, supporting male survivors and giving us a male survivor perspective. Thanks, over to you, Mike and Debbie.
Okay, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting us today. And I'd also like to say thank you for the previous speakers. And I was really moved during the last presentation, so it was nice to have a break at that point. So I'm Head of Training and Research for New Pathways, and I'm going to start the presentation today. My colleague Mike is going to be controlling the slides for me, hopefully. I think they're coming up.
First test, Deb. Can people see the PowerPoint already? Have I shared it correctly?
They can see your last slide.
Oh, okay. Let's go from the beginning. How's that looking?
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to shift our focus a little bit today and think about the experiences of males. Quite rightly, the conference will focus mainly on females because they're disproportionately affected. But as a service that is gender responsive, we wanted to kind of look at a different perspective today. So I'm going to put my hand up when it's another slide. So thank you, Mike. Okay, so we are an NGO. For those of you who don't know us, I'll tell you a little bit about us. We're based in South, Mid and West Wales and offer specialist sexual violence services. We provide services for people of any gender. The slides have gone now.
Sorry, beg your pardon. Is that working now?
No.
Oh, the wonders of modern technology. Bear with me.
That's lovely, thank you. And we're one of the largest sexual violence organisations in the UK. So although people often have to wait for services and things are often very difficult for survivors in Wales, like elsewhere, actually compared with a lot of the UK, South, Mid and West Wales and the services in North Wales, we're very lucky, I think, with the services we're able to offer. Okay, thank you. Hopefully the next slides are coming. You're not as good as Chris Whitty's helper, are you there, Mike? So in terms of the services that we offer counselling to adults, and that's adults either affected by something recently or non-recently. We don't tend to use the term historic because for our service users, they'll say there's nothing historic about what's happened to them. It lives with them, it's active in their present, in their daily lives, in the way they interact with other people, and in terms of the way they respond to the world. We offer counselling for children, and we work with children from 3 upwards. That service is changing its remit slightly at the moment, and we're going to be working with young people up to the age of 25 in that service, in line with other services and research on brain development. At the lower age range, we have play therapists, drama therapists, music therapists that will often work very creatively with children. We also offer verbal counselling as well. We offer group work, so we have group work for adults and for adolescents as well. Most of our group work focuses on psychoeducation, so in terms of helping people to cope better, perhaps with trauma symptoms, to help people learn more about stabilisation and safety. really useful often for people to share that space with other people who've gone through similar experiences. We've also got the Outlook project, which is based in Park Prison at the moment, offering counselling to offenders who've experienced trauma in their own lives as well. That's wider than sexual violence, but predominantly focused on sexual violence. We also have a wellbeing service. So if anybody is referred into counselling, they'll be offered support and contact by a wellbeing service so that people don't have to wait during that period. And so we can make sure that people are assessed, risk assessed, offered appropriate support from ourselves or from other services, perhaps while they wait for their counselling appointment or sometimes instead of counselling. We, at the moment, manage 6 out of the 8 sexual referral centres in Wales, which is the place where people will come for a forensic medical examination or police interview. And we have a team of crisis workers that will support people through that service. And we also have independent sexual violence advisors, ISVAs, which will support and advocate for people while a police investigation is going on, while people are waiting to go to court and through court as well. We have a Shore for Mental Health project that focuses on some of the allied issues that many of our service users experience and offers awareness raising and training for the sector and for our service users themselves as well. Training and research is a big part of our work. We firmly believe that the more people talk about these issues, the more informed people are, then the more able people are going to be able to disclose and get the appropriate help that they need. And we also have a counselling college which delivers counselling courses right from the very beginning in terms of their counselling journey through to supervision qualifications. And as part of that college, we offer a diploma in counselling for trauma. What we were finding in some areas, and I know other people have found the same, is that it was quite easy to recruit counsellors, but it was very, very difficult to recruit counsellors who really understood and were able to work with trauma. So that's a fairly popular course that we have running at the moment. And awareness raising, we tend to go to events like Freshers' Fairs, to Pride and other places in order to talk with people, let them know about our services and start some of those conversations. So over to thinking about males a little bit. So the Crime Survey for England and Wales, which is the end of March 2020 in terms of latest figures, said that there were 155,000 males aged 16 to 74 who'd been sexually assaulted over the last year. So if we think about that, that is just in the last year. So in total, that figure is going to be an awful lot more. Estimates are that less than 1 in 5 of these, so 19% of the males that said they'd experienced sexual assault by rape or penetration, the most, what police would call the most serious sexual offences, since the age of 16, had reported it to the police. So we know that reporting levels across gender are very low. But we're going to think a little bit today about why it may be difficult for males to disclose. Thank you, Mike. 5% of boys experience CSA. These are figures from the Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse. And we know from all research that girls in childhood are more likely to be abused within the home by family members, and boys are more likely to be abused outside of the home, particularly by authority figures in their lives. In terms of our services, our latest full year of figures are from 2020 to 2021. We had 532 males referred into us across our services. We were providing a service during that year to 672 males. And pre-COVID, those numbers were 750 male referrals into our services, which is 16% of our total referrals. Now, I think something interesting happens when we look at the figures in terms of our children's counselling service, which for this year would have been between the ages of 3 and 18. So in our children's counselling project, we worked with 110 boys, which was approximately a third of all of our counselling clients. But what we see is when we get into adult services and we look at adult counselling, this drops to 15% of the total numbers in that service. And I think that's interesting to begin to think about why males in adulthood might seek services less than the referrals we have in childhood. And there's many reasons for that, and certainly one of those seems to be that actually boys are referred in by other people, particularly at the younger ages. By the time we get to adulthood, a lot of our referrals are self-referrals or from other services as well. Okay, thank you, Mike. So we know for anybody that telling is difficult for many different reasons. But we want to focus today a little bit on why some of those additional reasons might be for boys and men. Thanks, Mike. So I'm going to talk about one of my clients. So my background is as a registered social worker and counsellor, and I still work as a counsellor in a private practice. So I want you to think about somebody that I worked with. He's one of my adult male clients and has given me permission to talk today. So think about him as a boy of 12. He's now in his 30s. At that point, he was in a lot of trouble at school. Social services had been involved with the family. He's got a stepfather that he doesn't get on with, and there's been domestic abuse within the home. He's got 3 younger siblings, and his mum is very busy with those siblings and coping with lots of the issues that are within that home, including being a victim or survivor of domestic abuse herself. He's got some difficulties with learning, and he's not particularly good at school. So in an attempt to help him manage his anger, a worker has got him involved with a local boxing club. This is something he really enjoys. He's actually quite good at as well. And that's important to him because he's not very good at much in life, he doesn't feel. And the lead coach says he could do well at this. He might make a lot of money, make a career out of it. He enjoys that escape to the boxing gym, and he's got a sense of belonging, a sense of esteem, and that feeling of being good at something for a change. However, at that age of 12, he's also being sexually abused by the lead coach. So, talking to him now, what did he have to gain by telling at that point in his life? Something he never did, by the way. Well, it might stop the abuse, he said to me. And then he thought, okay, what else? It might stop it happening to somebody else. However, he doesn't think it is happening to anybody else because this coach has told him that he's special and this is something just between the two of those. So he doesn't know anybody else is being abused. And those would be his reasons for telling. So in terms of what he's got to gain, he says to me, there was very little that he had to gain at that point. In terms of what's on the other side of that for him, though, what were his reasons not for telling? The fear that nobody would believe him was a big one. He's been known as the naughty boy. He has told some lies in his childhood there. The coach is very popular and very credible. There's nobody to tell. Who's he going to tell? The one person he'd tell about something that was troubling him would be the lead coach, who's the person he's closest to in the world at this point, and yet he's the person that's abusing him. He would get to keep the one thing that makes him happy. So if I don't tell, I get to keep this. I get to keep boxing. I get to keep being part of this. And he keeps the opportunity to have a career and make some money eventually. He's not going to do that through his academic work or studies. He gets to keep that feeling of mattering to someone. It's one of his primary attachments. He gets to keep that feeling. Also, he says to me now in adulthood, looking back, he's afraid that people would think he was gay. But he also recalls as an adult now being worried at that time that he might be gay. His body responded to the abuse. He recalls excitement. He has lots of confusion about his sexuality. He also doesn't know how to say it. How do I find those words? What do I actually say to somebody? What could I say? He's frightened that that boxing gym would close if he told anybody, and that others would be angry at him. And more than anything else, he says now, at that time, he was embarrassed, he was ashamed, and he didn't want people to look at him and see that abuse. He didn't want people to look at him and see what had happened to him. And lots of our clients will say the same. I'm worried about telling somebody. When they look at me, I want them to see me. I don't want them to see that abuse. He's frightened that he might be pitied. And the previous speakers spoke a little bit about that. And also at that time, he was worried that he'd lose control. If I tell somebody, that's going to start a process off that's going to be completely out of my hands. I know how to deal with this now, but if I told somebody else, I know the police might be involved, social services might be involved, my family might be involved, the school might be told. I know now how to adapt and manage and cope with this. So we need to remember, I think, how hard it is for many of our service users, and we're thinking about males in particular here at this point, to tell somebody. Often there is so much more to lose than they believe they have to gain. So I think very often the question in professionals' minds is, why didn't someone tell? When we really need to think about actually the losses that are often involved in telling for somebody. Thanks, Mike. So when we're thinking about males and disclosures, some of the reasons that people say, and research will tell us that males don't disclose, one is the myth of the cycle of abuse. So I spoke to a man who was in his 50s, and we were talking about why he hadn't come forward until a lot later. And he said to me, I didn't want anybody to think that I was abusing my own children. I was scared they were going to take my children off me because of this myth of that cycle of abuse, and particularly when we think of men. So we know with sexual offending, a history of maltreatment in childhood is a far bigger predictor for later sexual offending than sexual abuse itself. But I think that myth is still there very strongly for people. Lack of service provision for males. So around the UK, in many areas, there isn't a service for males. Even if a service is provided, does it look and behave like a gender responsive service? What are the images on the websites? What does the literature look like? Does that look like a service for men, boys, and people of other genders? or does it not? Does it look like we've just tagged you on to the core part of our service? The gender of the practitioner, sometimes there's a lack of choice or options in terms of who people can speak with. Lack of understanding that it was abuse, and I think particularly things like older female to adolescent abuse is often not recognised and perceived very differently, I think, across society. And I think perceptions play a part as well. So when we think about people and recognising the impacts of sexual violence, so noticing, asking and acting, are we seeing the possibilities in that population? And I'll give you an example of that, actually, how maybe some of our unconscious bias may impact us. We're a service that work by appointment. We don't tend to have a drop-in service. When I was working in one of our offices, when we were out in the community, so several years ago now, a male came to the door. And he was a man in his 60s. It was a very posh car outside. He was very well spoken. And the administrator went to answer the door to him. And she came round to see me and said, "Oh, Deb, can you talk to this gentleman, please? I've just made a mistake as well. I assumed he was a grandfather or a father coming to pick up one of the children from the children's project." Now, part of that, and even though she was somebody who was used to working with our client group and the mixed gender that we work with, part of that was her unconscious bias. In actual fact, what had happened was this gentleman had prostate cancer, and he'd just been having an examination in a hospital, and had gone into flashbacks and was really, really struggling because of his childhood sexual abuse. And the service had said, go to New Pathways. And instead of kind of just coming through phoning or whatever, he just turned up on our door, actually, at that point. That was the first time he'd told anybody about that abuse. And that was because of the intimate examinations he was having to have at that time. So I think we need to be very aware of bias in services and in our perceptions as practitioners as well. The perception that help-seeking behaviour is female, and that is a female trait somehow in society. So some of our societal norms that we've still got a long way to go to challenge and change. And defence reactions during abuse as well. So whether that male freezes or flops, as most of our service users do when they are raped or sexually abused. For men and boys, they often think, I should have fought back. I should have been able to do something about it. It's something deficient in me, rather than that natural defence reaction that happens without our conscious control. The physiological responses during abuse too. So it's very obvious, I won't go into detail, but if you have anal penetration, there is likely to be an erection, seminal fluid released, manual stimulation. It's obviously a lot more obvious with the male anatomy. That can cause a lot of confusion, but it can also be used by perpetrators as well to say, see, you enjoyed it, you must have liked it, nobody will believe you here. And sexuality, I think, is a part of this for some people. There may be questions about your own sexuality. You may not be out in terms of sexuality. You may be a man who has sex with men, potentially, and in a heterosexual relationship. People often have worries about homophobic responses from the police or from service provision, and concerns about their particular circumstances, relationships, sexuality being understood. Okay, thanks, Mike. So male survivors are even more likely than females to avoid help or disclosure and to minimise their abuse experiences. Will often present with behavioural consequences such as getting in trouble or in substance misuse. So I spent 20 years of my career in substance misuse services. Often when we looked beyond the presenting behaviours of substance misuse, there was many forms of abuse, as I'm sure you know, including sexual abuse there for people. So rather than those emotionally expressive issues such as being depressed, low mood, or saying they need help. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to Mike now to think about this a little further. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Deb. I'm going to try and multitask, which I'm not known for, to try and manage the slides and talk and not make everything crash. Anyway, good morning, everybody. It's really heartening to see how many people are here today, because it's a subject, or WSAS in general, is a subject that we really need to raise more awareness of, and it's something that Deb spoke about earlier. So the fact that so many of you have turned up today to this event and the other days of this event that are going on is really testament to the fact that you know, people are interested in this area of work, and that's really to be applauded. So I'm glad that you're here. Just by way of a quick introduction, I've been with New Pathways for 18 years now. My first association with New Pathways, I was a volunteer counsellor back in 2004, and I was working as a counsellor in Cardiff Prison. So I was working primarily with men who have been victims and survivors of sexual violence. My apologies in terms of terminology. I will use it interchangeably depending on the circumstance that we're talking about, and I know it generates some debate in terms of whether you should use the word survivor or victim or people that have experiences of. So I will try and use the appropriate term with the appropriate part of what I'm talking about. So prior to working with New Pathways, I'd worked for the prison service for 14 years. So to say that I started working with male survivors of abuse in 2004 isn't quite correct. I'd probably been working with them for 14 years before that, but blissfully unaware that I had been working with male survivors of sexual violence because people didn't talk about it. It was slightly different in the female prison estate, where it was acknowledged that a lot of the women that were in the prisons, whether that was Eastwood Park or Style or Holloway at the time, that they had suffered sexual violence, or they had suffered domestic abuse, and that they were contributory factors with them ending up in custody. So it wasn't a conversation that was happening. So even though I thought I'd heard most things for working in the prison estate for 14 years, it wasn't really until I started working with New Pathways and offering or making the offer that support is there for prisoners that had been affected by sexual violence to come forward, that they started taking up that offer and coming forward. And I was amazed. I was amazed by the numbers of people that came forward and sought help. And really, we hadn't been asking the right questions. The people have been there all the time. The issue had been there all the time. We just hadn't been asking them. So I worked with many, many men who came forward and disclosed. Often to me, I was the first person they'd ever told, and these were people that had probably been carrying this secret that they buried so deep for decades, quite often. And there were direct links with a lot of the people I work with between their offending behaviour and the abuse that they suffered. Most of them suffered childhood sexual abuse, which led them into poor coping strategies, substance misuse, the acquisitive crime that goes with that, and then the criminal career that led them into custody, and the difficulties therein of getting out of that system once you're in it. And Debbie talked about a lot of the abuse being perpetrated by people in positions of authority and in positions of trust. And there's been a lot of stuff in the press about sports coaches recently, and the like, people in churches and the like. So no wonder then, maybe little wonder that they would not disclose to police officers, to probation officers, to prison officers. So that's kind of where my story started, really. In terms of what I'm going to show you next, two of our male clients have very kindly allowed us to tell their stories, just to highlight some of the issues that they have faced, some of the barriers to disclosure that they have faced. And we'll talk a little bit those after the video clips that I'm going to show you. So we have two clients who we will call Richard and David. That's not their real names. Obviously, we want to protect their identities. So that the first video, Richard is actually, you'll hear the words spoken by Richard himself. So this is him talking about his experiences. The second one, David, his words are read by his counsellor who worked with him at our Cardiff office. So I'm just going to share that with you now, and hopefully the audio will work as well. So if not, somebody please flag up with me and I'll try again. Okay.
There's no sound yet, Mike.
Okay. Let me stop sharing and go back into sharing. Bear with me a minute. Let's start again. Tell me if the sound works.
The hardest part was
yes,
no one to reach out to, even though the hardest part was no one to reach out to, even though the schools knew I was missing school. Nobody ever done anything to wonder where I was or what was going on. The abuse affected me. I couldn't learn in school, so I suffer with dyslexia now, but I never could concentrate or do anything. So when I actually left school, the only thing I could get into was drugs, drug abuse, and a slippery slope. It was always violence, and it was just one thing after another, but it was all because of the abuse. I was masking it by what I was doing. I was always, because even though I was going to school to learn, I was always worried about what was going to happen next when I got home. Or, yeah, there was always a constant worry, so there was never time to concentrate on anything. Without coming here and going through everything that I needed to go through, I couldn't make the step like I have now and take myself forward, because I got to a point where too much was coming up. So if I didn't deal with it, I wouldn't have gone forward. So as for the future, that's all I can do is go from strength to strength, to be honest. I got nothing holding me back, so I've got no excuse these days. And that's what it boils down to, is pushing yourself.
As a child, I suffered violence, sexual abuse and rape for the first 19 years of my life. But as an adult, 34 years old, I thought that part of my life was over. Those 6 months were the start of 15 years of one relationship after the other, where violence and abuse played a part in every relationship I was involved in. As a child, I was beaten, abused and raped many times. I never realised until I was 50 years old just how much damage that period of my life had done to me. It was always easier not to face than to face. At 19 years old, I went to the police to report what I'd been through. I was laughed out of the station. After this, my faith in the police was totally gone. Regardless of the beatings I took or the danger I felt I was under, I never trusted the police and therefore never had the courage to report anything to them ever. There's a myth that a man's ego stops him from speaking out, from going to the police and seeking help, from talking to family and friends for fear of being judged. I can confirm this myth. This is not a myth, it's a fact. The bruises have healed, the scars have faded, but the mental pain and hurt are as fresh now as they've always been. Today I live with a new set of fears. The fear of a new relationship, the fear of allowing someone to get close to me. Without better education, new laws, tougher sentencing, the aim to end or at least reduce domestic violence, sexual assault and rape will be a very slow process.
Okay, yeah, I think Richard and David both very clearly set out both the impact that sexual violence had on their lives, and also they highlighted some of the issues as well. David spoke about the fact that he tried to go to the police as a 19-year-old, and he was ridiculed. I think he used the words, he was laughed out of the police station. And that ties into people's fears about, will I be believed? What will people think of me as a man coming forward in terms of saying, I have been affected by this, I have been a victim of this, and society's expectations of what men's responses should be. Deb talked about psychological responses to trauma, and the fact that regardless of who people are, the vast majority of people either freeze or flop. And it's something that we train a lot on. I know Deb does lectures on this, as have I, talking about psychological responses to trauma, and everybody expects themselves, or expects of themselves, that they will fight, that they will kick, they will scream, they will at least run away. But in reality, people don't do that. So it's quite difficult for men who have those expectations, maybe even more of themselves, because society expects men not to be victims, that those are the things they should have done. So that's really quite a barrier for men to overcome. Also, it was mentioned by David that he didn't tell anybody until he was in his 50s, after his first experience of disclosing to somebody and that going horribly wrong, and him not being believed and in fact being ridiculed. For the next 3 decades, he clams up, he doesn't tell anybody. And that resonates a lot with the clients that we work with. Something that Anne said, Anne, when she was doing the presentation on Live Fear Free, the Helpline, where she talked about the 81-year-old lady calling them seeking a refuge space. It's deeply distressing that people carry these issues for decades, and it put me in mind of a story similar to the story Deb told about the gentleman that came into our Cardiff office, where an elderly gentleman who was, I believe he was 80, or he was in his 80s, and he came into one of our offices to disclose that he had been abused as a child. He'd been carrying that around for 7 decades. Now, he didn't want help. He wanted to tell somebody before he died. That's not okay. So we collectively need to think, okay, how do we make it easier for people to disclose and come forward? And how do we make it that kind of scenario doesn't happen? I'm going to talk about now, just very briefly, about a case which came to light in 2017. And it's a case that raises a lot of questions, really, and it's something you may have heard of because it was high profile at the time, but we'll look at it anyway. Oh, let me skip forward. Okay, so some of you may have heard of this case because I say it was high profile at the time, of Reynard Sinaga. Now, this person is UK's most prolific rapist. All rape is abhorrent. The scale of this man's perpetration is almost beyond belief. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about this case. So he was convicted of 159 sex offences. This includes 136 rapes of young men in Manchester. So all of the people, all of his victims, and I use the terminology victim in this case, all of his victims were men, primarily young men. So his MO was that he lived in a flat in Manchester, in the centre of Manchester. He would go out in the evening, early hours, and there was 2 clubs were the main places where he kind of hang around outside these 2 clubs, and they were within 5-minute walk of where he was living. And he would wait for his potential victims to come out of these clubs, and it was generally single men who were either inebriated or they were on their own. They were all on their own. So he would act this Good Samaritan act, where he would offer to make somebody a cup of tea while they're waiting for a cab, or offer them a bed for the night if they had no means of getting home. Or he would simply approach people and say, the night's still young, do you come and have another drink with me? So those are the offences he's convicted of. He's suspected of raping more than 200 men. Now, the investigation was massive. And it involved an extensive operation with Greater Manchester Police in terms of the amount of evidence that they had to look at, and the amount of kind of digging they had to do to try and identify the victims of his crimes. There's still 70 odd people who they think who they are still trying to identify. From the evidence that they have gathered, and that process is ongoing. So Sanaga was sentenced to life imprisonment. I mean, in his summing up, the judge was saying that he was considering giving him a whole life sentence, which is normally something that is reserved for murderers and people that have committed the most heinous of crimes in terms of murder and mass murder. So he was considering that as an option. Instead, he gave him a minimum tariff of 40 years. So he's probably not going to see the light of day for a very long time, if at all. The only reason he was caught was because one of his victims in 2017 woke up during the attack and managed to dial 999 for help to arrive. So Sanaga kept a lot of footage on 2 mobile phones to give you a kind of idea of the scale of it. It was somewhere in the region of 3 terabytes worth of data. For those of you who don't know your kilobytes from your gigabytes from your terabytes, that kind of equates to somewhere in the region of 250 full-length DVDs or 300,000 images. So it gives you an idea of how prolific he was and how much evidence there was for the police to go through. One event that they recovered was an attack on a young man that lasted 8 hours. There was 8 hours of video footage of just one attack on one person involved. I mean, this is really quite shocking stuff. Just looking now at some of the feedback from people at court. You may or may not be aware, when cases go to court, the people who have been victims of those crimes, they can put forward impact statements for the court to consider when they're summing up their, what kind of sentence they're going to give. And there was numerous and frequent references to lives that have been shattered and people that were suicidal. And it really, the impact was immense. So these are some of the quotes from some of the people affected by this. To say as a man I've been raped is a hard thing. It makes you feel very vulnerable. Men don't talk about rape. We don't. We don't talk about rape. We don't talk about male rape. Why don't we? It's a good question. Why don't we? The next two, and talking about, somebody was talking earlier about self-care and what it's like to work in this environment and hear these things and look after yourselves. There's people in some services, like the police, for instance, that don't generally have the kind of self-care that ourselves as counsellors do and whatever, and they hear these things and have to deal with it. So the next two are statements from one of the investigating officers, and they're kind of the impact of what I did have on them. Gives you a kind of little window into what it was like for them investigating these crimes. So as I said, a lot of the evidence was because they had video evidence. So they were able to identify people either by their faces or other identifiable things on their bodies, like tattoos and stuff like that. So they were quite often, and we actually, New Pathways actually supported one of the people that was one of the victims of this man. And this happened to him. So the police identified him through the video evidence. The client, our client, was oblivious to what had happened to them. So the police had to go and knock on his door and say, "Is this you?" So, and these are some of the quotes from the police officer. So they just went very quiet. You see the colour drain from the face and that, oh my God, look on their face. And they knew that they were giving them information that was about to ruin their lives. And they knew that. So really tough as well for the police involved in that. And as I say, that this process is ongoing. There's another 70 odd people that they're still trying to identify from that evidence that they found. So this gets you thinking in terms of, I said it kind of raises some questions. It's certainly, when I think about this, when I've read about this, it's raised some questions for me. And I'd be more than happy for you to stick your thoughts in the chat, because I don't have all the answers. I have some suggestions or offerings as to why some of these things happened. So how did this guy get away with this? And how did he get away with it for so long? Why were there so many victims of this man? And why was he not caught? I think these are all valid questions to ask, and I have my own thoughts on that. I know Deb has her own thoughts on that. I mean, some of the things that I've thought of is, firstly, nobody suspected him. You know, I think there was one of the quotes that really sticks with me in my head, and it kind of plays itself over and over again. Is when they were investigating Savile, and somebody said Savile was hidden in plain sight. He was. Nobody suspected him. Sanaga was hidden in plain sight. Nobody suspected him. I mean, what does a rapist look like? You know, and this plays into all our stereotypes of what we perceive a rapist to look like. The guy was quite diminutive. He certainly wasn't somebody that you would see on the street and think he is a potential threat. What does a victim of rape look like? What does a male victim of rape look like? Again, what are those stereotypes? An interesting point to make, really, just on that point of stereotypes and whatever. Quite often there's a public perception that male victims of rape are homosexual men, and that maybe the rape has taken place within an intimate partnership relationship or whatever. The victims of Sanaga's crimes were, in the main, heterosexual. They weren't gay men. They were men that he targeted coming out of clubs in the early hours in Manchester. Another question to pose as well, given that he was so prolific and he was basically picking up men who were vulnerable and taking them back to his flat. If it had been taking women back to his flat, would somebody have noticed? Would somebody have intervened? Something Deb and I have talked about, actually, and you know, and Deb has actually said on a night out, she's seen that scenario where, you know, there's a woman who seems to be maybe in a vulnerable state, and a male is with her, and she's questioned that, and she's intervened and said, "Who are you? What's your intentions here? What is your relationship to this person?" And in fact, we're doing some vulnerability training in collaboration with South Wales PCC. We're doing training for nighttime economy staff in Swansea on vulnerabilities, and so that people can spot the signs, be curious, ask questions, intervene. And so we also cover the issue of males. And as Deb rightly said, I mean, as an issue, women are far more likely to be affected by rape and sexual violence than men. We accept that. Doesn't mean that men aren't. And I think this case really highlights that it's something we need to look at. Also looking at on that fact as well, are women likely to be more risk aware? I mean, men might be risk aware in terms of potential threat of violence or robbery or whatever. But on a night out, are they risk aware in terms of there's a potential that I could be a victim of sexual violence? I would suggest that they maybe not. So they were probably less wary of Sanaga's intentions when he was saying, "Come back to my flat, wait for a taxi here. It's cold and wet out here. I'll make you a cup of tea." Also, we've talked about the barriers of disclosure and how difficult that can be. So maybe one of the reasons why he got away with it for so long is that because if a lot of his victims were drugged, if any of them had suspicions that something has happened to them because they've woken up with no memory, if they've woken up with no memory, are they likely to join the dots and think, has something happened to me? no, I would suggest that that is a conversation that women may have more readily with their friends, in terms of, I have little memory of what happened last night. Is there a possibility that something's happened? And then maybe talk to their friends about it, who may encourage them to look further, maybe seek some support and help. With a man, maybe that might not be the case, that they would wake up with little memory and then be thinking about, okay, why might that be, and what potentially may have happened to me. So there's all those kind of issues in terms of, you know, why this guy wasn't caught, why he was able to get away with this for as long as he did. One of the questions for me, I know we're coming to the end of this, but I mean, I want to allow a couple of minutes to maybe come back to any points that you've made, is I haven't got an answer to this, but given that this guy was the most prolific rapist in British history and one of the most prolific rapists in the world, why are we not talking about it more? I was expecting after this case that we would have a deluge of referrals, an avalanche of awareness raising about male victims and male survivors of rape. It hasn't really happened. So that's a question I'm still trying to answer, and it's a question I'm quite happy to pose. Anyway, I'm going to stop sharing that. I mean, I don't know how we are for time, but Deb and I are happy to take any questions that you have or comments.
Thanks, Michael and Deb. I've been trying to keep an eye on the questions in the chat, and I think there was one for information which has been shared, and I don't think that there was anything else that anybody wanted to ask. I'll give it a couple of seconds now to see if anybody starts typing.
If I could, something I would echo, and coming back to what Gary said before, there will be people on this call that are affected by the issues we're talking about. Please do not carry this around for decades. There's help available, there's good help available, particularly in Wales. There's excellent help available in Wales. Please come forward, get some help.
Fab. Thanks, Mike. And yeah, just to echo that, so if you were affected by any of the information shared or the victim and survivors stories, please contact again the Live Fear Free helpline, or get in touch with one of the organisations presenting today, such as New Pathways. Thank you. Okay. So moving on to our last presentation of the day. Thank you. So there's the Live Fear Free helpline. And our last presentation today is from Claire Carroll Rees, who's the Psychological Therapies Lead for Adults for Traumatic Stress Wales. And Claire's going to be speaking today about vicarious trauma in frontline workers. I'm just looking for Claire, if I can see her. Yeah, there she is. Oh, okay. Lovely. Thank you. Thanks, Claire.
No worries.
Hi, Claire. Would you like us to share the slides, or are you sharing them?
Hopefully I should have. That should be.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Fantastic. So hopefully everybody should be able to see that. So thank you so much, Joe and all, for having me. It's really lovely, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to hear the really inspiring presentations and about the work that's been going on within the network. So I'm here to give a slightly different perspective, I guess, really, which is just trying to kind of think about it from an occupational point of view. So I work in Traumatic Stress Wales, and our remit is to help people that are exposed to traumatic in terms of thinking about how we can support people working with these groups, and how we can kind of think about helping them to understand and to minimise the impact of trauma within the workplace. What I'm going to be talking about today is what do we mean by traumatic stress and vicarious traumatization? I think it's a really interesting topic, and there's lots to kind of come out of it, I think, in terms of what we can do to support people within our pathways. Also thinking about how do we know if we've been impacted by trauma within our work, and also what approaches might be helpful to people and to organisations. So just starting with what is vicarious trauma. So a definition that I really like is vicarious trauma is a process of psychological change resulting from empathic engagement with trauma survivors. So thinking about this, the vicarious trauma and also secondary traumatization. So what we're talking about is people in the workplace that are exposed to traumatic material or stories when in their work of helping people that have survived trauma. And for vicarious trauma to take place, there has to be a process of you need to be exposed to traumatic material, but also you need to be engaging empathically with that material in order for you to experience this vicarious traumatization. So you need those two parts of it. You need exposure, but you also need that empathic engagement. And I think what's really interesting around this is that anyone can be potentially affected, including doctors and other health professionals, but people particularly that within their work, their role is to empathically engage with people who've survived trauma and to help them with the impacts of trauma and to hear their stories. Actually, by definition, those are the conditions that are necessary for people to then experience vicarious trauma. So I think it needs to be looked at in that context, that it's not something that's kind of located within the individual, but actually it's a kind of a contextual factor that's related to people's work.
Sorry, Claire, to interrupt. You're dipping in and out a little bit. Would you mind trying to turn your camera off and just speak, because the connection I think isn't very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Better?
Yes, thank you.
Well. Okay, sorry about that. So I don't know if there's bits of missing around that, but it was just talking really about the vicarious trauma or secondary traumatization to happen. You need to be exposed to traumatic material or to hear about people's traumatic experiences, but you also need to be able to engage empathically with that person in order for you then to kind of experience the secondary traumatization. And so people like counsellors and people in helping professions are particularly vulnerable to that. In terms of what we know in terms of the other risk factors for it, so contextually, there are things that are kind of about your role or about the service that can make you more likely to experience vicarious trauma, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. But also there's something about the cumulative or repetitive impact of it. So if you're hearing about trauma, particularly similar types of trauma, on an ongoing basis, repeatedly, it tends to have a cumulative effect on the person that's working with survivors. So how we might know if we've been impacted by it? Well, the different sorts of difficulties that people might experience this. So you might have feelings of hyperarousal. So you might notice you're starting to become anxious, irritable, feeling angry. And you also may sort of feelings of sadness and hopelessness about the future. And what we know is that people sort of burn out. So you kind of get emotional disengagement, so that empathic or compassionate disengagement with the material that you're hearing or you're exposed to. You might withdraw emotionally. You might have what we call presenteeism. So presenteeism is where you are actually turning up into work, but actually you're cut off. You're not sort of able to engage in the same way. So your kind of levels of compassion and empathy are kind of really impacted. And as I said earlier, these are the actual tools that frontline workers are required to use in order to help people. So this term compassion fatigue is a really kind of useful one, and it's a really parallel process to what goes on in vicarious trauma. And you may also experience feelings of guilt or shame. So sometimes people have moral injury, so that kind of sense almost of that sort of helplessness and not being able to help more, or kind of feeling like they should have been able to kind of do something. And also sometimes hearing about kind of awful perpetration. I mean, the presentation before was a really good example of that. For people along the process and those helping professions, it's just thinking, kind of bearing witness to that. And that sense, it can really sort of affect your kind of your sense of kind of morality and kind of, you know, so that's that sense of connection with kind of human connection with other people that can really be impacted when you're bearing witness to kind of really unspeakable things. You might find that you're over-identifying and or overextending your role. So that's kind of the opposite really to burnout. But what you might find is it's difficult for you to kind of keep your boundaries, or you may be kind of wanting to help somebody in a way that's over and above your role. And you may also experience some intrusive images and nightmares about what people have sort of told you. So you may notice that you're starting to kind of get those kind of images and you're re-experiencing it, or you might get repetitive thoughts that you're really unable to switch off from. So those are some of the things that we might know if we've been impacted, but there's a real sense of sort of physical and emotional exhaustion that you get when you've experienced this repetitive exposure to traumatic material. And so it's a kind of a real sort of thinking around how we're impacted by our work. And I've used the term burnout. So burnout can be something where actually it's not necessarily kind of one specific traumatic experience that you're exposed to, but it's that kind of prolonged repetitive experience of actually kind of feeling like there's this content that's emotionally, cognitively draining for you, and actually it's kind of having a kind of real impact on your well-being. And so to an extent, it's just trying to kind of think about kind of, so how can those be managed in the workplace? How do we know when they're starting to become kind of a significant distress? And kind of what can we do to help? So what we know about vicarious traumatization is it's not just about the exposure to stress, and it's not just about that empathic engagement with people's trauma stories, but it's also about contextual factors. So what we know is it's the contextual factors in the workplace and in people's roles that kind of really impact on them and can really kind of make them more likely to experience difficulties emotionally and in terms of their well-being. And so these contextual factors are things like the level of support within the organisation, the kind of the demands of the role, the culture of the organisation, and the sort of support and training that's offered by managers. And I would argue that this is the level that actually most importantly, because actually if we can get this right, then actually that we can prevent them people kind of developing such significant impacts in their work. So essentially this is sort of trauma-informed organisations. And I've put on the side, I've put this thing around the Trace Toolkit, because this is work that's going on at the moment in Wales. It's just trying to kind of think about what does trauma-informed organisations look like, and what are the main principles that we kind of need to develop as an organisation in order for them to be in enabling environments and really support staff that are kind of doing this empathic engagement with survivors of trauma. So some of the kind of the things that we think are really important within this are to ensure that staff are properly prepared for their role. So practically they're prepared for their role, they've got the right equipment, they kind of understand what they need to do, they feel competent, they feel prepared. But also psychologically. So I think it's really important that we start to have these conversations with people kind of around what the psychological impacts might be of this empathic engagement, and kind of how we can kind of support people to do that. What are the signs that you might start to recognise in your work? We can also then start to kind of think about recognising and mitigating the impact of working practices on emotional stress. So starting to kind of think about the role, you know, whether we can kind of vary the kind of tasks that people have, making sure that people have got kind of breaks built into it, and understanding really the kind of the types of activities or the types of pressures on people that are most likely to lead to that emotional stress. So it's really about kind of having an organisational structure that is actually kind of building these kind of work into their staff support structures and their planning. So culture of safety and continuous learning. So looking at role specific training, looking at kind of constantly updating that. So we know that continuous learning and training really helps in terms of staff well-being and engagement, but it's also just helping them just to kind of think about what they can do to support, to support each other, how will they know when they're starting to be impacted, and what tools do they need. And having this culture of safety, so psychological safety, but also physical safety. So people feel okay to kind of say if they're feeling stressed, if they've been impacted, that kind of talking about emotional well-being and trauma is part of your language at work. So thinking also about practical things, so thinking about balanced caseloads and taking regular breaks is really important, because we need to kind of help people to develop their coping strategies, and we know that to do that you need to feel rested, you need to feel supported, you need to feel in control of your work-life balance. All these are factors that will enable people to do this work. As I said, so things like rest and work-life balance are really important. So kind of thinking about what the culture is within the organisation and making sure that having that work-life balance is prioritised is a really important part of people's tools that can enable them to do this work. facilitating social bonds and support. So social support, we know, is the main protective factor for people who are exposed to trauma. And social bonds, that informal social support within colleagues and within teams, is hugely important. And the research that's come out in COVID is that those teams that are facilitated to provide that informal support to each other, both throughout their work and also following a traumatic event, actually they do far better. And so that's something that managers can do, which actually doesn't take too much resource or too much time to do, but just making sure that you're facilitating opportunities for teams to do that. And also then in terms of managers, so that you're providing supervision. Reflective practice spaces are really important, because people need to be able to explore the impact of their work on their feelings and their well-being. And again, that needs to be normalised, because otherwise you can build up into the culture actually just kind of carrying on with things that, you know, it feels kind of sort of almost the stigma around not being able to cope. So what we need to do is to build these spaces in as a regular thing, and it needs to be in a culture of being able to explore that impact on your work. So I sort of put this slide as food for thought really, but for managers and for leaders, it's how well do you know your staff? How well do you know their backgrounds and their risk factors? Because if people have got risk factors, if they've experienced their own adversity or trauma, it kind of, if people have kind of some difficulties kind of in their lives, or stresses are going on in their life at the moment, which is going to impact on their resilience and their coping, or if they've got particular risk factors, these are going to all be impacting on their vulnerability to developing trauma and compassion fatigue. So really just thinking about how well do you know that? What's your plan for supporting them following an exposure to trauma? And as I said, for people who are frontline staff, that this is their role, is supporting people who've experienced trauma and being empathically engaged with them, then actually it needs to be a kind of a constant kind of almost like risk management thing of actually this is a constant exposure to trauma that they're experiencing. So therefore, what's your plan to support them with that? And this sense of it, if it's not your role, then whose is it? So it may just be as a particular leader or manager that isn't their remit to kind of do that psychological support of staff. Whose is it? So you need to kind of have a sense of who's going to take on that function for people. And I've used this in quotes, psychologically savvy leaders, but it's a quote that I really like. But it's a sense that actually that these are the kind of soft skills that leaders and managers really need to have and really need to foster in order to kind of keep staff safe who are exposed to trauma as part of their role. So that's the sort of the general principles really that we think are really important in terms of trauma-informed organisations, and some of the things that you use can mitigate the contextual factors within the workplace. But immediately following exposure to trauma, I mean, as I said, I think when staff are exposed to trauma on an ongoing basis as part of the daily wellbeing counselling sessions or, you know, support sessions with people, then actually this is a kind of constant process that you need to be thinking about really. But as the cumulative impact of trauma, so actually for staff, it may be that they're feeling they're coping well, they've got good resources, and actually they feel very confident in doing the work psychologically. But for some staff, if they've kind of got particular impact on their coping outside of work, particular stresses, particular things that are happening within the organisation, so for instance, you know, particularly high workloads, particular high stresses within the workplace, that might impact then on people's ability to cope with trauma. So as we said, social support within teams is a major protective factor. And so what I would really encourage managers and leaders to do is to give colleagues space and time to provide informal social support to each other. And as I said, comforting routines can be really important. So having a cup of tea together and, you know, so doing familiar things within the workplace can be massively important in providing that social support. Colleagues might find it helpful to discuss details of what they've experienced and why it was quite tricky for them, and they might find this very, very helpful, although they don't have to do that. So it may just be that routine of sharing a cup of tea together or sharing that support in itself can be extremely helpful. The evidence base would suggest that single session debriefing isn't helpful and it's not recommended. So we wouldn't, straight after a traumatic experience, we wouldn't necessarily suggest or recommend that people get offered any sort of debriefing. And also counselling or psychological interventions immediately after a traumatic event. Similarly, there's no particular evidence that they're particularly helpful, because what we do know is that these kind of levels of stress or distress after traumatic experience are very, very normal and quite adaptive and seem to kind of be your way of kind of making sense of it really and processing it. And so we don't think that counselling or sort of almost like pathologising it after actually is kind of particularly helpful. So what we do think is that offering opportunities for that social support within teams. Pragmatic support, again, may be necessary and can be really reassuring. So I've worked with people who've had a particularly kind of shocking day, have been particularly distressed by it, and the managers have offered to call them a taxi home so they don't have to drive home. That in itself can be really reassuring, and I think can be just giving a really kind of clear message of support and empathic leadership, which can be really reassuring for people. So I'd really encourage that people are prepared to kind of do this kind of psychological support and this pragmatic support as well, to make sure that people do feel cared for and supported within the workplace. And these things, I mean, they're not only specialist interventions, but actually the evidence would suggest that this is the kind of work that actually really helps people to cope. As staff, as individuals, what we can do, experiencing trauma, is self-observation of our signs of stress and burnout. So again, this to me would be part of this occupational support that we're offering, and these reflective practice and the supervision stuff is, but also saying to people is like, how do you know when you're starting to feel stressed or burnt out? So it's developing those skills in self-care and self-reflection in staff, so that people have a really good sense of when they're starting to be impacted by it. Thinking about what we notice in terms of our feelings, sensations, thoughts and behaviours. So starting to kind of think about those different impacts, because we know that compassion fatigue and trauma will be impacting people's cognitions. They'll be going over and over it in terms of their thinking, or they might find that they're disengaged and they're feeling numb. Physically, again, there might be such feelings of anxiety and hyperarousal within their body, but it also may just be that people are feeling particularly kind of cut off or disconnected. And behaviourally, you might sort of notice that you're particularly sort of isolating, so you don't want to talk to people, you don't want to engage with your normal support networks. So again, these are things that are really clear pictures for us, but everyone's got their own kind of way of coping with things, and so we need to kind of get a really good sense of when you're starting to kind of be impacted by it. And then try to maintain routines if possible. So what we think to happen is, if you've experienced trauma, then actually if you can maintain your routines as much as you can, it can be really helpful and really comforting, and it helps you to get back to normality as quickly as possible. In some cases, those routines may need to be adapted. So again, it's about checking in with that, and it's about being responsive to changes that do need to be made. And what I would say is, within routines and activities, it's about prioritising soothing and self care. So it's not so much about this sort of achievement activities, kind of cracking on with, you know, your tasks or your parenting, all that sort of stuff. But actually what's particularly important is that you do prioritise the self-care, the soothing, those sorts of activities. And so we'd really encourage that people do that as a sort of a strategy if people have been impacted by trauma. We also think that gentle exercise is really helpful to do that. So even if you don't fancy kind of going to the gym straight away, but it's just having a nice walk around the park or something, but exercise can be really helpful, and there's good evidence that can be good after kind of experiencing a traumatic event. Avoid alcohol and drugs, because there's a particular tendency to disengage and to numb feelings and cognitions using alcohol, particularly. But we think that can, you know, make it particularly difficult really for people to process what's happened and to get back to normal. So thinking then around informal supports and comforting routines with colleagues. So again, as we've said, but it feels like particularly important for people to reach out to colleagues. A particular kind of risk really is if people have experienced trauma at work and then they go off sick, or they take time off work, which could be really helpful in the short term, but what that's doing is actually making it more difficult for you to access that support. And we know that people, when they are at home, then tend to have a tendency to sort of ruminate or to kind of avoid. So I'd really encourage people to reach out to that support with colleagues. And again, as managers and leaders, it's about facilitating that, even if people are off work, and to check in with them. So be aware of the risk of self-isolation and avoidance, and then talk to friends and family if you're comfortable with doing this. So friends and family, if you wanted to talk to them about what you've experienced, and obviously not disclosing any details, but it can be really helpful to do that as a really adaptive way of starting to make sense and to cope with things. And reflective practice and supervision within the workplace are really important. So it's just, again, thinking around that thing about how you can have opportunities where people can process what they've experienced, talk about it and think about how it's impacted on them. And that feels like a very normal part of working life. It's really routine, and it's not just brought in as a response to a specific event. And then lastly, just thinking about when might we need therapeutic therapeutic help. So as I said, going along those different factors, you've got these contextual factors within work, and we think that if we can get those right in terms of making it a trauma-informed organisation, you've got enough support from managers, the managers are aware and know their staff, they've kind of got helpful balance of roles, there's an awareness of psychological and practical preparedness for their role, and there's support structures in place in the workplace. But we also know that for some people these difficulties may go on, or they might get worse, and for some people it can lead to secondary trauma such as PTSD or other psychological difficulties. And so generally we'd say kind of if after around a month after experiencing a traumatic event in the workplace, the person's experiencing significant and ongoing distress, the research would show that actually it's likely at that point that that's not going to spontaneously come down, and actually they might need some support counselling for themselves in order to make sense of that and to process that. And we know that evidence-based therapies are really effective. We know that particularly people may go on to develop PTSD, so things like re-experiencing of what they've heard. They might be avoiding work, they might be avoiding talking to people, they might be avoiding particular triggers, they might have hyperarousal, so ongoing severe symptoms of hyperarousal, so panic, for instance. So if people are experiencing significant distress, it might be PTSD or it might be other kind of difficulties, so risk of low mood, for instance, or anxiety. Particular risk factors are having previous experience of adversity or trauma. So we know that if you've had experience in your own life, or particularly your childhood, and then you're exposed to trauma in adulthood or in work, that can be a particular kind of risk for you developing ongoing difficulties. And we also know, as I've said, that lack of support is a particular risk factor as well. So if people haven't got support around them within their family or their support networks, and if there isn't that support within work, then that can be a particular risk factor for people to develop PTSD or other difficulties. And as I said, it's actually trying to kind of encourage people that if they do feel like they need therapeutic help, then there's therapies or interventions that are really helpful. And I put a link on the right hand side. So Health for Health Professions and Wales HHP. So that's a scheme that's been funded by Welsh Government for people working in health and social care that have been impacted throughout their work, and it's confidential, and it's some free counselling that's available, as well as other sort of guided self-help and social support resources. So that's an organisation in terms of a pathway for supporting staff that can be really helpful. And so that's it really. So that's just thinking really about the kind of workplace factors, about kind of what you can do to support people immediately after they've been exposed to trauma, and how people can sort of do some self-care and some support for themselves in order to feel like they're starting to kind of move forward again. And also if people feel like they do need more help, then actually how to access therapies. So I'm going to finish there, and if anyone's got any questions.
Thanks, Claire. I think that I'm just trying to look at the questions. We had a couple of statements. Just scrolling through now. So Catherine Simpson said that just thinking about our risk factors and backgrounds and talking to managers about them can be tricky. Not all will want to share details. And she wonders if there's some sort of self-scoring system that could be used to allow people to communicate when they need more support, but not forcing them to discuss something in detail, in that they're not really able, wanting, or ready to do so. Is there any available?
It's a really good point. So what I would probably recommend is that approach gets normalised within the workplace. So things like reflective practice and supervision. So I think that's really important. If those conversations can be had within the staff teams in terms of people's normal well-being, then I think it makes it easier to disclose and to report things. I think the question you've got about whether there are any specific screening measures or something is a really interesting one, actually, that I'd not thought of, but potentially that is something that after an event people can maybe have a way of screening that, and maybe there can be a kind of a system that they can kind of report into leaders or supervisors. So I think that's a great point.
Thank you. And we've got another question from B, asking if all the services are free.
So HHP, all of those services will be free that they get referred to, yeah.
Thank you. And I think that's it, unless anybody is typing away at the moment. Lovely. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for that, Claire. That was a really informative presentation on how, you know, we need to be aware of vicarious trauma, and how organisations need to become trauma friendly and trauma focused so that we can ensure that our staff are kept safe. Okay, there is a question from Gail that's just popped up. I'm not sure. Could you answer in the chat, please, Claire, if you've got any? It's okay, Gail. If you could you answer the remaining questions in the chat, if that's okay. So just to bring day 2 to a close today, thank you everybody who's presented today and who's attended the event. I've really enjoyed all the presentations, and I think from the chat that I've been keeping an eye on as we've been going through, that everybody else has as well, who's been part of the day today. Just a reminder that all the resources, links and video recordings will be available on our webpage, which will be shared in due course. We have a further 2 events to complete the series of learning events that are on the 24th of March, which is going to have a focus on minority groups, Black and ethnic minority, LGBTQ+, and older people. And then on the 30th of March, we have an in-person forensic event being held in Cardiff. So all those, those 2 registrations are currently on Eventbrite, if anybody would like to sign up to them as well. So it's just for me to say then, diolch I chi gyd am ddod i'r digwyddiad. Thank you everybody for attending the event, and we hope to see you at one of our later events. Thank you.
Thank you very much.